Welcome to the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Annie Thayer and I'm the State Authorization Coordinator for the CU Boulder campus.
Thanks, Annie. And I'm Cheryl Dowd. I'm the Director for the State Authorization Network. Welcome to the SAN virtual seminar. I'm going to head inside to meet up with the other panelists, but while I get situated, you're going to hear from Mike Abbiati and from Joe Garcia about WICHE and WCET. See you inside.
Hi, I'm Joe Garcia. I'm the president of the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, what we affectionately refer to as WICHE. I'm here to welcome you to the virtual seminar for the State Authorization Network and to tell you a little bit about what WICHE is and how the State Authorization Network grew out of that. WICHE is an interstate compact that was formed by originally 5 Western states, but now consists of 15 Western states and the Pacific Territories, and it's all about providing greater access to and improving the quality of higher education opportunities. So we really work not to build new institutions, and we don't enroll students ourselves, but we work to help states and institutions better serve their residents to build the kind of workforce they all need. So we've been around for all these years, and we have 4 different divisions. One of those divisions is called the WICHE Cooperative for Educational Technologies. Now, WCET is all about helping institutions, its institutional members, better provide access to distance education or technology-enhanced education. And WCET, unlike WICHE, has members all around the country. So it's not just a Western organization, and states are not members, but institutions are. Now, growing out of that, we have the State Authorization Network. The State Authorization Network was formed to help institutions address the complicated, the varied regulations that impact an institution's ability to offer services in a different state other than where it is located. Now, if you are an institution and you have students or programs who do business really in another state, that other state has the right to ask you to be authorized in that state, but every state has different requirements. There are people at all of your institutions. The people attending this seminar are those individuals whose job it is to make the institutions compliant with those state requirements. So the SAN really helps to do that. It brings people together to share resources, to share ideas. So it's much like what WICHE does overall. Our goal isn't to create capacity, but really to coordinate capacity, to bring people together to share ideas and resources in order to provide better services to all of our residents. So again, we're here to help you. We hope you have a very good seminar. We know that our experts here at SAN are committed to making your lives a little bit simpler, your jobs a little bit easier, and the service you provide to your students a lot more effective. So thank you very much and have a great seminar.
Hello everyone, I'm Mike Abbiati, Vice President for Educational Technologies for the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. I'm also Executive Director of the WICHE Cooperative for Educational Technologies. Now I know you've heard from President Garcia about the relationship between WICHE, which is our parent organization, and WCET, which is one of the 4 operational units of WICHE. But I want to say a few words about the relationship between WCET and the State Authorization Network, SAN. As you know, you're here for this virtual seminar that is sponsored by our SAN program, State Authorization Network. And we're all very proud of the team that's working on this particular seminar and certainly all the workshops and seminars that our SAN team does each year. Now, the State Authorization Network is formed to work on a very, very important piece of the higher education pie today, that being the online courses, the online degree programs, and all those technology-enhanced learning opportunities that we provide for students all over the world. The SAN organization is focused on interpretation of some very complex regulations that the federal government has placed upon online learning specifically, And those regulations are indeed negotiated by and interpreted by our partners at the National Council for State Authorization Reciprocity Agreements. And SAN is the group that works with our campuses, that works with all kinds of institutions to explain what the regulations actually mean and to explain the concept of continued compliance with the regulations. This is all based on helping to provide student success opportunities. Now, it's important for those of us that work with SAN, for everyone to understand that under the WCET umbrella, we're very much focused on student success in 3 areas. First of all, policy and practice, what we actually do to deliver content, and that's very specifically curated digital content throughout the entirety of the United States and certainly beyond. Secondly, we work very, very hard to be sure that we're providing the framework for our organizational members, and WCET's members are not states, as WICHE has state members. WCET members are nationwide in their institutions and organizations. And so we work very, very hard to try to come up with the ideas and to survey what works in the whole era of technology-enhanced education. And thirdly, we're very focused on advocacy. And that's advocacy of technology-enhanced education throughout the entirety of higher ed. And a big piece of that is indeed policy. And SAN is a very, very large piece of the policy. The difference between WCET and many other organizations is that we are a small organization. We're a boutique organization, if you will, and we bring together the middle management, we bring together the senior management, we bring together the individuals that set the policy framework for higher education. And that's perhaps a little bit different. Some of our sister organizations that do a lot of faculty development and those kinds of things, that's not what we do. When you come to WCET and you come to SAN, you're learning why technology-enhanced education is so important to student success. Not necessarily the how, not necessarily the when, but the why. So the audience for our SAN seminars is different many times. Many of you are compliance officers. Many of you are registrars. Many of you come from other management positions at your institutions. And we appreciate so much you being here. We appreciate you being part of the SAN family. And we look very much forward to hearing what you have to say about our virtual seminar. And I wish you a very successful, very pleasant experience as we learn more about the State Authorization Network and what that means to your organization.
Hello everyone, welcome to this very special event. We created this virtual seminar so that we could reach across to our SAN members to discuss the special convergence of state regulations, SARA requirements, current federal regulations, regulations that are to become effective July 1, and also the new PROSPER Act that is in its infancy form for the HEA reauthorization. It's important that we be able to talk with you about these today so that we can identify what is actually currently required and what an institution must be able to do to be compliant with what is currently required. So today, I'm very pleased to have this esteemed panel. I'm very honored that they were willing to participate in this with us today. So we'll start to my right. I have Marshall Hill, who's the Executive Director for NC-SARA, the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement National Council. Thank you, Marshall, for being here.
Thank you.
And we have Shari Miller, who is an attorney and consultant with Institution Compliance Matters. Thank you very much for being here, Shari. And we also, to my far left, have Sylvia Rosa-Casanova, who is the Director for Private Post-Secondary Ed at SCHEV, which is the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. And we have, to my immediate left, Russ Poulin, who is the Director for Policy and Analysis at WCET. And later on, within our discussion, we're going to be discussing some of the practical matters. And when we do that, we're going to add to our group Christine Galdston, who is an institution compliance staff member. Her title is the State Authorization Compliance Specialist with the University of Colorado System. So as I was mentioning, we're going to have two pieces really to our seminar. We're going to talk first about the state and federal landscape for regulatory landscape, and we will also move to practical matters in the second part of our seminar today. But to get us started, Russ Poulin has created for us a video that is about the foundation of state authorization.
Hello, and welcome to our virtual seminar on state authorization. We know that some of you are new to state authorization, and some of you could use some reminders about some basic points about state authorization. So we're going to present to you 4 different points that will be repeated several times throughout this virtual webinar. Number 1, it's the states that oversee higher education. They are the ones that decide who gets to offer degrees or programs within their borders. Some think that it's the federal government that's in charge of this, but it is actually the states that have had the laws, the state authorization laws, for years, and they're the ones who are in charge of overseeing higher education activities within their states. Number 2, some people think state authorization is just about distance education. It's actually about any activity that you do in another state. So that may be that a student is in a practicum, you may have an employee in another state, or you may be recruiting students in another state. Any of those activities could trigger the need for you to seek approval in that state. Third, let's talk about students. The need for approval is based upon student location, not student residence. So is where the student is actually physically located while they are participating in the activity, whether it's taking a distance education course, participating in a practica, or any other activity offered by your institution. 4, there's actually 2 types of approval that you have to worry about. There's the institutional approval, in which the state approves the entire institution to be able to offer any sort of activity in the state. Second, if you have professional licensure programs, or programs such as teaching or nursing or psychology that allow a student to sit for professional licensure within that state, you also have to follow the rules of that board for that profession. While the states are responsible for state authorization, the federal government decided to get involved in 2010 when it decided to tie federal financial aid eligibility to institutions having the proper approvals in each state in which it serves students at a distance. In 2012, that regulation was overturned by the courts. While that was done on a procedural ground, they did find that the Department of Education did have the right to issue such a rule. In 2014, the Department of Education tried to bring back the regulation through a process called negotiated rulemaking, but that effort failed. In 2016, the Department of Education issued a brand new set of federal state authorization for distance education rules that are slated to go into effect July 1st of 2018.
Thanks for laying the foundation for state authorization and the initial federal regulation of state authorization. I've received a few questions from some of our members about this. First, we have a question from Walter Rankin from Fairfield University. He indicates that for him, the biggest question has been how to determine what qualifies as a physical presence in a given state. This seems to differ quite a bit from state to state, he believes. Perhaps we could highlight any particularly confusing or highly regulated states in this regard.
Great. Well, thank you, Cheryl, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. That is a good question because physical presence rules do vary quite a bit from state to state. And so you might think that actually being in a state would be the thing that would trigger physical presence, but it could be that you're doing face-to-face courses there. It could be that you have an address there or a phone number there, or that you have adjunct faculty in a state for some states. And so you have to figure out what these rules are for the different states. Last time I checked, there are only about a dozen states where if all you have is distance education and you're doing nothing else in the state, where you have to be regulated in that state for offering distance education there. However, what happens is that quite quickly you start doing other things where you have a proctored exam in the state, or you decide that you want to do a face-to-face activity in a state, and you quite quickly get up to having to be regulated in all these different places. Now, one of the great things that we're going to talk a bit more about later is the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement. And one of the things that it does is that if you're a member of that agreement, if your institution is a member, that they have a single definition of physical presence that is applied across all of its member states. And that simplifies it greatly. If you're not a member of SARA, you do still need to go back and figure out what is the rules and what are you doing in the state, and what are the rules in the state, and do you need to be regulated in that state?
I think sometimes there's also the confusion about whether a student doing an experiential activity outside the state of the home state of their institution, and institutions need to be aware that that could also trigger physical presence if a student's doing an internship or something like that.
Yeah, that really is an issue. Sometimes people think this is just about distance education, and it could be any activity that you're doing in the other state, whether externship, internship, field trips, and oddly enough, the District of Columbia likes to regulate field trips that go there, and that was quite a surprise to some Eastern institutions that weren't very far away. So anytime you're in that other state, you need to figure out, does that activity trigger the need for regulation?
Well, thank you very much for that input. We also have another question from one of our colleagues. Laura Storms from the University of Texas, El Paso has asked, we have several programs, international and/or distance education, for which students are not able to use Title IV funding. Would these programs still be governed by these regulations, and if so, how are they affected?
Okay, would they be governed? Well, unfortunately, the answer is yes and no. I'm sure people are delighted by that. And so the question was about for Title IV. So for federal regulations, remember that the federal regulations are all about federal financial aid, the Title IV financial aid. And so those sorts of things that are not for credit or not part of federal financial aid, that those wouldn't be part of those regulations. However, we don't stop there, do we? That there are states that will regulate activities and they don't care whether it's Title IV or not, especially if they're credit activities or something for which somebody has paid money for. And there's even some states that will regulate some non-credit activities as well. So we always have to think about this, that what is the federal responsibility in a state and what are the state regulations as well, because they could differ. And Sylvia, I know that you work a lot with this. Is there something that you would like to add onto that?
Yes. Education is a function of the state.
Yes.
And so each state determines what education they are regulating and how they are regulating it. When you talk about federal financial aid being a part of whether that has to be regulated, you have to determine in that particular state, because all states are different, and we will continue to talk about that, but you have to determine if the activity that you are doing in that particular state is regulated by that particular state.
I'm glad that Russ is here to talk with us today about the status of reauthorization of the HEA, Higher Education Act. He's also going to be able to share with us information about the current federal regulations as they relate to state authorization and the 2016 federal regulations for state authorization of distance education that are slated to become effective on July 1, 2018. But let's start first with the Higher Education Act. Russ, what exactly is the Higher Education Act, and how does that affect state authorization compliance?
Well, the Higher Education Act is something that was started in 1965 to include all the rules and regulations that the federal government has in dealing with higher education, and especially in terms of federal financial aid or any other funds that you might get from the Department of Education. These are the rules that they use in terms of making sure that things that they want to have happen within the institutions. Remember, as Sylvia said, that really higher education is the purview of the states, and so that they regulate who can offer a degree or not. But there are things that by using that hammer of money, and whether you get aid or whether you get grants or whether you get other sorts of funding, that the federal government uses that. And then they started that act way back in 1965. It's updated every now and then. It's been 2008 since the last one, which makes it actually a very long time since it's been changed. And that one of the things that they do in there is that all of the regulations about distance education and what they're doing, anything that federally, what courses are available for aid and not, and where. Those are all part of the Higher Education Act. And so as those rules are coming out, we'll want to watch very closely what any new rules might be that we need to be enforced or that we need to comply with. So.
Do you expect the HEA reauthorization to be enacted before July 1?
Well, they're working on it. So as we mentioned before, the House has their bill. As we're recording this, the Senate is working on a bill at the same time. And I thought about bringing my magic 8-ball to try to answer this question as to what exactly will happen, because depending on who you talk to, whether something will get done this year or not is really unclear. So that's the best answer we're probably going to be able to give, because I know the Senate really wants to get this done. They really want to try to move it forward, but it's 2018, there's going to be elections in November, that if they don't get this done by sometime midsummer, and by getting it done meaning both the Senate has to pass something which will be different than the House, they'll need to talk together and come up with whatever the final version will be. That's a lot of work given everything else that is on the plate of Congress. One pundit said that the likelihood of it passing this year is approaching 0. Now we should still be paying attention. Right. Because all the work that's done on this, that even if it goes over the next year, will probably be the foundation for whatever is done next year. So we really need to be watching it. But I sort of lean toward that probably will not happen this summer.
Okay, Russ, I know you explained in your video that the 2010 federal regulation 600.9C was vacated by the courts. But are there other federal regulations that institutions should be mindful related to compliance management for our out-of-state activities of institutions?
Yes, there's a couple that are out there, and one has to do with misrepresentation, and so that if anybody from your institution is giving out information that leads to the student to make a decision that ends up being detrimental to them, you tell them that they could be a fireman by taking your courses, and they can't be a fireman at the end because the courses don't fit that. You have misrepresented your program, and so that is one that you need to watch out. And you also need to watch that. We've mentioned this as a federal thing, but many of the states have misrepresentation rules as well, and so you may get hit on both of those if you're doing something where the student could look at the information and reasonably make a decision that probably wasn't in their best interest. And so we need to look at that. The other federal regulation has to do with complaint procedures, and that there is a requirement that every institution supply for both prospective and for current students, both, all of the complaint processes that are out there for the accrediting agencies, and then also for any of the authorization agencies, so any of the agencies like Sylvia's that are overseeing the institution in that state, that they have to notify the student how they can complain to that agency.
Well, thank you, Russ. We do have a question. Our colleague Jamie Henthorn has a question.
If an institution is silent about whether a program meets licensure requirements, is that misleading to a student?
Well, that does end up being a problem, and so thank you, Jamie, for the question. I just happen to have something to read here that very interesting. So I didn't memorize Chapter 34, subsection 668.72, subparagraph N of the federal regulations, but here one of the things that's I didn't.
Why not?
I didn't. But I know you have it.
Absolutely,
Marshall. But I get that. But it talks about. This type of it's talking about misrepresentation, and it goes into this type of misrepresentation includes, in the case of a degree that has not been authorized by the appropriate state educational agency, or that requires specialized accreditation, so like nursing or teacher ed, some sort of approval or accreditation, any failure by an eligible institution to disclose these facts in any advertising or promotional materials that reference such degree. So again, any failure to disclose this, and so that ends up being a misrepresentation as well. And regardless of the federal regulations, that what happens where institutions get into trouble is actually with lawsuits as well. So what happens there, that you have not told the student that no, indeed, they cannot get a nursing degree in the state of Tennessee or whatever state that it is, because your program does not meet the requirements, that we've seen these types of lawsuits happen where the student will say, well, look, here's all the materials I was given, here's the information about the program. Nowhere does it say that after spending all this money, I won't be able to get my degree. And so even regardless of what regulations say, you want to protect yourself and inform the students.
Mm-hmm. Mitigation, yep.
Let me add a point here. Russ, you and I do lots of presentations,
right.
And we get lots of questions like that one. And we're increasingly asked to give legalistic answers to them. And I know you and I both try to stress the other side of this.
And that we're not lawyers.
That's right. There's a moral responsibility for institutions to provide students the information that they need in order to make good decisions. And I encourage people to think about what kind of information would you like your son or your daughter or your nephew to have before making a decision, and then provide that early on.
Yes, yes. That's really good advice.
Well, and on top of that, to stress this point, this is effective now. So institutions should be complying with this regulation now. This isn't something that may go into effect in July. It's something that's effective now. So institutions should be providing this now.
Again, going back to the state, it is very important for an institution that is providing education in a field that leads to licensure, that they determine what is required by the state. Because the state there's an agency in the state that provides that licensure. And it's not necessarily the state that is regulating the education. So you're going to have multiple agencies. So the thing is to know whether you are in compliance with the state licensing agency where that education is taking place.
And how do you respond to the institution and say, well, we never had to do that before?
Oh, well, they may not have thought that they had to do it, but technically the state, again, has always had the regulations and the laws in place. Mm-hmm. They may not know that they had to investigate and see whether they were in compliance with those state laws and the agencies.
Ah, okay, good point.
And we know ignorance is no defense.
Yeah.
Right. Good points. Good points. Okay. We have a follow-up question to these federal regulations. Another one from Jamie Henthorn is,
may an institution just provide the link to an online list of state complaint contacts to satisfy the regulation?
Well, let's go back to, there was some previous guidance under the federal regulation that was out a few years ago, back in 2010, that said, yes, that is acceptable, that if somebody is maintaining a list of all the complaints in all the states, that you can go ahead and provide a link for that. Now, the worry around that is that they also went on to say that, however, it is the ultimate responsibility of the institution to make sure that that list is up to date. Mm-hmm. And so we have had some time where there have been some lists out there that haven't been kept up maybe as well as they could be, or there have been some changes and that they're not in there. So you do want to, you just don't want to put the link out there and then forget about it for the rest of your life. You want to make sure that that link is also being updated as well.
so ultimately it's the institution's responsibility.
It is ultimately the institution's responsibility.
Perfect.
And this is a common theme in other areas as well, as we'll discuss in professional licensure. And so I think it's helpful for institutions to have a regular procedure or protocol that, you know, on a routine basis, a student worker or somebody is checking all the links that they have on any of their compliance sites, just to make sure that they are working.
You also have to be able to find them too. Yeah, I've noticed that there's some institutions where they'll take these complaint links and that they'll put them someplace where, unless you had the exact link, you would never find it even with a search. And so make it so that if I wanted to search for it, I could find these links very quickly.
Has to be accessible. Okay, well, let's turn to what I think is the most complicated issue today, and that is the newest federal regulation that was released in December 2016. It came out on my birthday, folks. Anyway, I know, happy birthday to Cheryl. So this regulation is scheduled to be effective July 1, 2018. And Russ, would you please tell us the specifics of this new regulation?
Well, no, Cheryl, I'm not going to go through all the details of this regulation, but I'll give you some highlights of what people should be worried about for this regulation. First of all, one of the things going back to what we're talking about with this federal regulation, that they want you to demonstrate that you're in compliance with any state in which you're enrolling student and issuing federal financial aid. So if you're enrolling, we've got the University of Kansas up here, and you're enrolling a student in Nevada, that you're following the rules in Nevada. Or the second part of it is that they've recognized reciprocity. So we'll talk more about the state authorization reciprocity agreement, that is a way that you can demonstrate that you're in compliance in that state, either by going state to state, using their processes, or by using SARA. So those are two things that are in there. There also are a whole load of disclosures, student disclosures that are in there, and there's some that are public, where you have to tell people that if there's a special refund policy in a state, that you have to tell them about that. But most of them have to do with programs that lead to professional licensure. And it gets back to this issue that we talked about before, that you need to let students know whether for that nursing program, whether they can then sit for licensure within that state, or whether they can do practica in that state, or whether your program meets the needs for that nursing program, psychology program, teacher ed program within that state. You're supposed to tell them that up front. And I know institutions are struggling with that. It is a state by state thing that you have to do, try to figure that out. And certainly through our state authorization network, we're trying to help out our institutions in doing this, but it is something that will be a requirement in this. There also are some individualized disclosures that will be part of this, and individualized means that this is something that, rather than putting it on your website, is something where you actually have to send them an email or a letter, if anybody still does letters, or any of those things, that you actually have to send a communication to the student for a couple things. One is back to professional licensure. Let's say that you have a student who's in a particular state, and that you've informed them that you do not meet the nursing licensure requirements for that state, but the student wants to enroll anyway. Perhaps they're in the Army or something, and that he knows he's going to come back to the state where the institution is, and is going to become a nurse there. And so that it doesn't matter, get it. But it's something where you need to get in writing from that student that they were notified and that they understand that. So, and then the final individualized disclosure has to do with if you have any sort of adverse actions, and this has to do with, like, if you lose your accreditation, or if Sylvia comes after them and says, okay, you're no longer authorized in Virginia, that you're supposed to notify students of that. And both of those seem very reasonable things. If you have something that affects the student, that you need to let the student know that those things have happened. And so there are many other things that are in there. I guess there's one other thing that we'll get into about the definition of residence, which we're not all very pleased about, but those are the main things that are in there.
Great, thank you. We do know that there are a lot of questions from our members and from others about what these regulations are saying, and we've reached out to the Department of Education to ask for some clarification about some of the language that they've used. And we'll try to address some of the questions based on some logic that we may have. And there are a lot of questions about the disclosures, and I know Shari Miller is going to be able to share with us specifically information about disclosures later in our seminar. But first, I have a question from one of our members.
Hi, I'm Lisa Siefker, the State Authorization Program Manager at The Ohio State University. And my question was about a requirement in the federal state authorization regulation that states that a state must have a student complaint process in place in order for an institution to be authorized in that state. Specifically, I was wondering if there is an update about California's progress toward establishing a complaint process, and if not, if SAN had any recommendations for current California students that might be enrolled, and how to move forward with those students.
Well, there is a lot more awareness from the agencies within California that this is a pending issue and perhaps they should do something about it. However, I'm not aware of any legislation that's in place to try to remedy this, and I haven't heard anything about the Attorney General's office stepping in and maybe wanting to be the place that will take the complaints for this. And so if the regulation goes in place on July 1st, and we're starting to hear some soundings that it probably will, that this could be a hole here in terms of what are institutions and what's supposed to do and what are students supposed to do around this. We really, really need clarification from the Department of Education on this. The last time that we had a similar issue with California around in-state institutions and complaint processes, it took them probably 4 or 5 years for them to work out an agreement with California on this. So my guess is what will happen is that those students will probably technically be out of compliance, or, well, the students won't be out of compliance, the institutions will be out of compliance, which could put those students at risk, which is the worst part. But I'm hoping that the department and the state of California will work together to try to figure out what is the accommodation that they can do in the meanwhile, and that they'll tell us about it. That's always the thing, is that sometimes these things go on and they're not tell us about it. So meanwhile, institutions are left with, well, should I continue enrolling students or not? So, and until we find out exactly what's going to happen with the state authorization regulation, until we find out exactly what's going to happen with some of these other things, I'm not sure that I would be, that I would want to tell institutions to not enroll students from California at this point, but they should have that in the back of their minds, because maybe, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been a lot of surprises in Washington the last few years here, and things that have happened. So, so be prepared to try to act, but I wouldn't do anything rash at this point.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that my colleague Marianne Boki is offering for Kristen Brown from the University of Louisville.
Some of our programs are post-licensure programs, like the RN to BSN. The regulations say that we need to have disclosures for programs that someone could reasonably believe leads to licensure. To us, it is not reasonable to believe that a post-licensure program would lead to licensure. Who is to say what is reasonable?
Yes, yeah, well, I'm not sure that it actually says reasonable in the regulation. And I think a lot of people have used that word. But the answer is, who gets to determine? It's the states get to determine. And I've had this conversation with folks from several institutions where they say, well, we don't think that they should be regulating such and such. Okay, that's fine. It's not an opinion poll. If the state decides that it's going to regulate a certain profession, then they're the ones that are regulating that profession in that state. And so you do need to start figuring out, is there any likelihood that they would regulate it? For a lot of the things, as she mentions here, like the RN to BSN, I cannot think of a single state that regulates that. That doesn't mean I'm wrong, you know, then there could be one out there. But it would be good to do some checking on that to make sure if you suspect that there could be a state out there. But it does go to the states. They're the ones that do the declaration, and you do have to try to figure out, does the state regulate that program?
And I think another aspect to look at is also that students are consumers.
Yes, yeah.
And that they can challenge anything legally at any time, whether there's a sound legal theory to back it up or not. The fact of the matter is, filing a suit against an institution because maybe they're claiming that they should have been informed about the RN to BSN, even though it's post-licensure. The challenge for the institution is they still have to defend the suit that's filed against them, which takes time and money. So I think we just have to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, and falling back on the reasonableness of all of this really doesn't work, because, not to throw Louisiana under the bus, but Louisiana is the only state that regulates flower arrangers. Now, I don't know if a flower arrangement fell on somebody or what happened there that made it so that they wanted to regulate it. But for most people, they would never have thought that that would be something that would be regulated. And so that could translate to other fields as well.
We do have another question from one of our members, Dawn Brandt from Lancaster Bible College.
Hi, I'm Dawn Brandt from Lancaster Bible College in Pennsylvania, and we'd like to know how the federal regulations apply to programs offered in a hybrid format.
Well, that's a really good question, and again, this is another one of those areas on the federal regulation, we really need clarification from the Department of Education about this. For some of the disclosures, they have specifically put in there that those are only for 100% online programs, but then they say 100% online, and then they give caveats to that. And so that things like if you're doing tests in the state, or if they do some a practica in the state, so there's just some caveat. So it's not 100%. And so it's a bit unclear how they're going to apply that to the rest of the regulation. But even with the federal regulation being a bit unclear in terms of what's in or what's out, the thing we always have to remember is Sylvia in the States.
In the state, right.
Is that if you're doing anything in another state, any sort of activity, and especially if it involves a student, that might be a different answer than for the federal one. Would you like to say a bit more about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, okay, so this is a good example. Let's say that it is a blended program, and part of that is a face-to-face class, and then the portion that is being offered online is coming from a separate state. So in other words, XYZ University has XYZ Online that is providing that from a different state. Well, the online portion may have to be regulated by the state where the education is coming from. So if I am, for example, in Tennessee, and I have a blended class, and part of that blended class is coming from South Carolina, where the main office of that institution is, Tennessee may regulate that online education coming in.
And we have one final question on this content area. It's from Robert Schnurr from Colorado State University.
Hi, my name is Bob Schnurr. I'm from Colorado State University, and my question is, what do we need to know about foreign country authorization required as of July 1, 2018? And will SARA be involved in this?
So the new regulations around state authorization and foreign countries really is very narrowly applied, and it's actually not applied to distance education at all. So what it affects is that if you're an institution, so you're the University of Nebraska and you decide that you're going to have University of Nebraska Dubai, or what have you, and that you're going to set up a branch campus there or a location there, that you need to get that approved by the agency that's in charge in Nebraska in order to be able to do that. And so it's specifically around that. It's not around if you are offering distance education courses or programs to people who happen to be in Dubai. And it also does not affect those institutions that are in partnership with foreign institutions. So let's say the University of Nebraska wants to partner with an institute, with the University of Dubai, that they do a partnership and maybe do a year where you go over there, or a degree that's in partnership and that you go over there and finish part of the degree. That's not covered under this either. So it's not for distance education. And so there's really not a whole lot for SARA to be involved on this, but Marshall, would you like to comment about SARA's interest in these types of issues?
Well, we're interested in lots of things, but that's outside of our sphere of influence. SARA is an agreement between member states, not between United States and any foreign countries. Now, I wouldn't mind visiting lots of places, desirable places, and talking about this, but no, I don't foresee, at least in the near term, any involvement by SARA in getting any necessary authorizations to educate students in foreign countries.
Now, the other thing that people need to remember is that if you are enrolling students at a distance, that you are subject to the laws of that country.
Yes, you are.
Yes, yeah, and people sometimes they think, well, it's state authorization, that's just a thing among the states, but it's actually wherever that you're enrolling those students, and so you need to. And it's just like the states. Some have very strict rules, and some have very little or no rules at all, and so it gets very complicated to try to figure out across the different countries.
So that illustrates really a general principle, right, is that the legal requirements are tied to the location of the student. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that institutions know where their students are, because if you don't know whose laws you are potentially violating. Right. And that can include states as well as foreign countries.
Very good, yes.
Great. Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone. We've talked about how federal regulations must be followed, and we see that compliance is based in the state laws. Most SAN members are aware of state authorization reciprocity, or SARA, but I am aware that there could be some folks that are not part of a compliance staff that are watching our program here today. And so in order to share with them what SARA is, Marshall has prepared for us a video about what the state authorization reciprocity is and a little bit about how it was put together. So we're going to go to that video.
Hello, my name's Marshall Hill, and I'm the Executive Director of NC-SARA. That's the National Council for State Authorization Reciprocity Agreements. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about SARA, what it is and what it isn't, and how it came to be. So SARA is an agreement between member states, territories, and districts. I'll just say states as we go forward. That helps colleges and universities who enroll distance education students in states other than their own. SARA helps them streamline the process that they would need to go through in order to get the approval or authorization from those other states to legally enroll students. SARA was implemented and now operates with the assistance of 4 regional education compacts. Those are the New England Board of Higher Education, the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, the Southern Regional Education Board, and the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. Along with those 4 regional compacts is NC-SARA, the National Council for SARA. NC-SARA works to ensure that the 4 partners work together so that we have a nationwide reciprocity agreement rather than 4 separate regional agreements. So SARA is a voluntary agreement. Each state decides whether or not it will join. If it does decide to join, it applies to one of these 4 regional compacts that I mentioned. Those compacts, by the way, were not started to enable SARA, but they've been around for decades. So a state decides to join, it applies to a regional compact, and if it is approved, it then invites its eligible institutions to participate. And in the same way that states can decide whether or not they will join, institutions can decide whether or not they are going to participate. So the first state to join SARA was Indiana, and it did so in February of 2014. So as of March 2018, just 4 years later, 48 states, all but Massachusetts and California, have joined SARA, as well as the District of Columbia and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Puerto Rico has applied for membership, and Massachusetts is working on its application. We have about 1,750 institutions that now participate in SARA, and they must believe it's a good value for them because we have an annual institution renewal rate above 99%. So why do institutions join? Well, the principal benefit is that, in general, SARA institutions may offer their distance education programs in any other SARA state without having to go through that state's normal approval process. That greatly streamlines the process for SARA institutions, and it saves them a good deal of money. The greatest benefits to students, if they study at a SARA institution, are a broader range of distance education programs from which to choose, the assurance that SARA institutions meet certain minimal quality standards, and they have access to SARA's full range of consumer protection provisions. So to join SARA, states must agree to abide by SARA policies on matters such as institutional participation, handling of student complaints, and similar things. Institutions of all sectors, public, independent, nonprofit, and independent for-profit that meet SARA requirements can apply to their state to participate. So what does an institution need to do to join SARA? First, it must be a US-based institution that's authorized to award degrees, that is, an associate's degree or above. The institution must be accredited by an accrediting body recognized by the U.S. Department of Education and approved by the U.S. Department of Ed to accredit institutions that offer distance education programs. The institution must comply with a set of guidelines developed by the country's regional accrediting bodies. If it's a non-public institution, it must have satisfactory financial standing in regard to some federal metrics, and the institution must agree to comply with SARA policies. The institutions apply to join, and then they must renew every year, at which time their compliance with rules is evaluated. Well, as to how SARA got started, it actually goes back longer than most people realize. In the summer of 2010, Paul Schiffman, who was then the executive director of the President's Forum, that's a group of institutions that do a lot of distance education. Paul convened in Dallas, Texas, a group of individuals, states, and institutions and distance ed organizations to talk about barriers to the expansion of distance education. In 2010, there was a lot of discussion nationally about our country's educational attainment, post-secondary educational attainment, and a growing realization that distance education delivery can play an important role in improving our country's educational attainment. The Lumina Foundation for Education provided some money to gather those people for a discussion, and as they talked about the problems facing expansion of distance education, the number one problem identified with this group of people was the challenge and expense of becoming authorized in states other than the institution's home state. So having it focused on that as a problem, Paul then asked Lumina Foundation to provide some money to develop a solution. They did. They suggested that work be done in conjunction with the National Center for Interstate Compacts, which is a group at the Council of State Governments organization. And so individuals from those organizations and those groups came together in what later came to be called the President's Forum / CSG drafting team. It's a group of about a dozen people, some of them state regulators, some institutional representatives, some from state higher education officers, who came together in the fall and winter of 2010 to 2011 to help develop a solution. The drafting team produced a white paper and in summer 2011 circulated that for comment. That first paper was largely drawing on the knowledge, expertise, and drafting skills of Alan Contreras, who was a part of the drafting team and who had previously been the state regulator for Oregon. I was a part of that drafting team, and we settled on reciprocity as the basis for moving forward. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provided money to convene a group of people to critique that initial white paper. It was an energetic meeting. Significant revisions were made after that, and the following fall and winter, members of the drafting team perfected or revised the initial plans and started additional talks with other groups. It was at that point that members of the 4 regional education compacts approached us with their desire to become involved in implementing this solution. And we agreed to work together. WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission, was the first to assemble a group to look at particulars about how that might be done. Their efforts were followed by parallel efforts in the other 3 regional compacts. And there was large and broad agreement about how a reciprocity-based approach could be done. A parallel effort was going on, and that was a National Commission on the Regulation of Post-Secondary Distance Education. That was a commission put together by SCHEV, the State Higher Education Executive Officers, and APLU, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. It was chaired by the Honorable Richard Riley, former U.S. Secretary of Education and previously the Governor of South Carolina. That group met throughout much of 2012 and on into early 2013, following which a national meeting was held to release the results of the Commission's work. The Commission's work largely validated the efforts that had gone before, and on the basis of that fairly good reception, WICHE, on behalf of the 4 regional compacts and what was eventually to become NC-SARA, went back to Lumina Foundation with a request for funding to implement SARA. Lumina provided $2.3 million for that work to support both the National Council offices and SARA work at the 4 regional compacts. They later increased their funding to total $3 million. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provided about $225,000 in support, and SARA began. As I indicated, the first state to join SARA was Indiana in 2014, and we've just been had our heads to the ground and moving forward ever since then. In the fall of 2013, a board was selected, a National Council board. That board had its first meeting November 1st of 2013, set institutional participation fees, which haven't changed since then, adopted several foundational documents, policies and standards, a set of bylaws for itself, and so forth. So a number of states quickly followed Indiana, and in February 2014, after Indiana became the first state, many states and institutions followed. And as I indicated earlier, as of mid-March 2018, 48 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Virgin Islands are members of SARA, and almost 1,800 institutions participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Marshall, for putting that video together that explains SARA. I have a quick follow-up question. What is the impact of the July 1st federal regulations on SARA?
I think there's likely to be very little impact, except for misunderstanding that people at institutions may have about that. There will undoubtedly be newspaper articles about that. People will say, oh, if the rules are deferred or delayed, that must mean we don't have to worry at all about state authorization, ignoring the point that we've made previously that state authorization is about states. The one other aspect that is significantly different in the coming rules are the notifications that Russ talked about. Those are significantly more specific than SARA has required. Some institutions might think that they are a SARA institution, that they don't have to pay attention to the U.S. Department of Ed rules. They're incorrect about that. If they are an institution that participates in federal Title IV funding, they have to obey those rules regardless of whether they are participating in SARA. So we'll do what we can to try to make that message obvious to institutions that do participate.
Great. Okay, we have another question, Marshall, and my colleague Miriam Boki is going to share this with you.
We do have a question from Catherine Brown, University of Florida. As the lone state authorization person at a new SARA institution in a new SARA state, I'm overwhelmed by the task of researching state-by-state regulations that supersede SARA. For example, clinical placements in New York's licensed professions trigger a physical presence in New York State and require prior approval, even for SARA institutions. Is there a resource where the state regulations that supersede SARA are maintained by state?
Well, first imagine doing the work of state authorization of distance education prior to SARA. There was no substitute for doing all of that research state by state, which meant that institutions were usually in one of two positions. Either they were doing all that work and spending a lot of time, effort, and money to do so, or they were ignoring it and therefore likely being in violation of state laws all over the country. And second, for the basics of state authorization, SARA states regulations just plain aren't supposed to supersede SARA. States that join SARA agree to a certain set of rules of the road, and they are to follow those. What I think you're really talking about are all of the requirements dealing with state licensure. And Shari will talk a good bit more about that, but those vary enormously from state to state. SARA does not cover those. A recent report from the Council of State Governments indicated that various states choose to regulate almost 1,300 licensed professions. Russ's comment about Louisiana regulating flower arranging. Various states regulate all sorts of things. Personally, I believe the solution to this kind of licensure approval is going to be within the licensed professions themselves. The state boards of nursing examiners are going to solve this problem for themselves if it is solved. The state boards that govern teacher education licensure, if that problem is going to be solved, they are the ones that are going to be solving it. There's some progress in those areas, but not a whole lot. So why in the world do states do this? I think the basic two reasons are consumer protection, to ensure that their states are well protected. And frankly, the second reason is a bit of turf protection. I used to work at the higher education agencies in both Texas and Nebraska, and I used to joke that the only thing that every institution could agree upon is that my office ought to keep everybody else out. And there's some truth to that. Every institution ideally would like to do whatever it perceives to be in the best interest of itself and its students. And then they would like the state agency to keep other institutions from doing anything that affects them. And so the balancing of that plays out very differently in every state across the country. And I think over time, one of the interesting things about the last few years for me has been observing how institutions seem to accept that they can't expect a great deal of state protection from online delivered education. And that's progress, I believe. So the SARA initiative provides those protections, but in a somewhat reverse way to the way in which they were previously done.
there's a second part to this question, and I'd like to generalize this for you to ask you if there are any tools in place that can help the institution find the kind of information they need from higher ed agencies and state boards to be able to do this work.
It is a real challenge, isn't it? It's very difficult to know what questions to ask and to know of whom to ask them. NC-SARA and the SAN network are going to be working together to provide some additional information, be housed on the NC-SARA website. For those of you that have been familiar with the SCHEV information, we're going to be taking that over and doing a good deal of work to keep it up to date. That'll help somewhat, but because of the complex nature and volume of all of these questions, there's only so much it can do. I think it will be quite helpful, but there really will still be instances where institutions will need to contact state agencies that deal with nursing, teacher education, or flower arranging in Louisiana.
Well, and I've understood from our interactions with some of the state boards that they want to be able to interact with the institutions directly about what their programs are. So it's not going to substitute the institutions having to have that kind of interaction. Okay, thank you very much. Would you please share with us a bit about what is expected of an institution that is a SARA participating institution?
Well, first let's talk about what an institution needs to be in order to participate in SARA. First, it can be from any sector. It can be a public institution, an independent nonprofit institution, or an independent for-profit institution. It must be a U.S.-based institution that's authorized to award degrees by a governmental entity. Usually that governmental entity is the state in which it's located, but it can be the federal government, for example, for the U.S. Air Force Academy in West Point, or it can be tribal governments for Native American colleges. Secondly, it needs to hold accreditation from an accrediting body that is recognized, that's a term of art, recognized or approved by the U.S. Department of Education. And that accrediting body must also be authorized to approve and accredit institutions that offer distance education programs. The institution needs to assert over the signature of its chief executive officer or its chief academic officer that it does comply with and will continue to comply with the interregional guidelines for the evaluation of distance education. Those are a set of standards that have been developed by the regional accrediting bodies, the 7 regional accreditors of the United States, and all SARA institutions, whether they are accredited by one of those 7 organizations or accredited by a national accrediting body, must agree to comply with those. And then lastly, if they are a non-public institution, they have to have a satisfactory score on the U.S. Department of Education's assessment of their financial responsibility. This is called the Financial Responsibility Composite Score. Lastly, they do need to agree to comply with all SARA provisions. They then apply to their state, they are evaluated by their state, and approved by their state for SARA participation.
Great, thank you. And you can find the SARA manual on nc-sara.org, correct?
NC-SARA.
NC-SARA.
Yes.
.org. But the manual is very important. Institutions must read the manual.
Yes, indeed, and we are about to release a new version of that.
Marshall, thank you very much for that. I do have a question to follow up from our colleague Julie Getz from Huntington University. Outside of additional steps that may need to be taken for programs that require licensure, does membership in SARA mean that nothing else needs to be done in SARA states? No contact with Department of Education or Commerce, no additional fees?
Oh, wouldn't that be nice? But the short answer to that is no. To emphasize the one point again, institutions that offer programs that need to licensure do need to deal with state licensing agencies for each of those professions. in every state in which they offer the programs. If the state requires all out-of-state businesses to register or pay a fee with the Secretary of State in Kentucky, Colorado, Nebraska, where have you, SARA institutions must do that as well. There are some occasional other issues. Colorado has some rather unusual requirements dealing with workers' compensation. So out-of-state institutions that enroll distance ed students who live in Colorado need to comply with those provisions of Colorado law. So there are a few things like that. So why didn't SARA solve all those problems to begin with? Well, doing what we did was a challenge enough, and we'll leave some other things for a future day.
There you go. Thank you very much. We have another question from our colleague Kim Sneed from Georgetown University.
Hi, my name is Kim Sneed, and I am the Assistant Registrar for Program Registrations at Georgetown University. I would like to get clarification on what exactly is the requirement for reporting the number of online students that we have. Do we report where they are as their permanent address, or do we need to report where they are when they take the course or program that they're in with us?
Finally, an easy question. So, institutions should report where the students are located when they are taking the course or the program. We recently released the NC-SARA 2018 Enrollment Reporting Guide that has some additional information on that question, covers that and a lot of other points. Now, we recognize that this capturing of student location is never going to be perfect. But we need better data than we now have. So even though the U.S. Department of Ed and its coming in July rules muddies the waters on this, for SARA purposes, and we think what they really meant was report where the student is located when they are taking the course.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Marshall. My colleague Marianne Boki is going to provide a question from our colleague Kelly Karki from Kaplan University at Purdue.
Kelly Karki from Kaplan University, Purdue has a question about institutional loan disclosures. I have seen regulations passed for Florida, Indiana, California, with Maine and Maryland in process. The regs that are passing require institutions to provide the total amount of interest, principal, average loan payment amount, and a myriad of other things, depending on the state. My question is this: does being a SARA institution in a SARA state make any difference regarding the reporting requirements? I'm thinking not. Also, with an institution being in a SARA state, how is an institution made aware of these requirements?
Well, I agree with you, Kelly. SARA institutions will need to comply with those state requirements as passed by the various states. As to how institutions become aware of them, NC-SARA will work with SARA states and the regional compacts to help spread the word and provide some suggestions, if we can, to institutions about how they can comply. We'll try to be quite redundant about that and explore multiple ways of getting the word out.
Great, thank you. And this was a very good question by Kelly. It's not something that we've addressed as much lately. So we've talked about the federal regulations and the SARA requirements for institutions. Let's take a step back for a minute and fully comprehend why a state would regulate an out-of-state institution that offers activities to students in the state. We've talked about it a little bit. Sylvia has provided a little bit of that information, but we're going to turn now to Sylvia. We're very glad that she's with us today, and we're going to ask her to please share why states may wish to provide oversight of out-of-state institutions that are going into another state to offer activities.
From the state regulator perspective, the most important piece of information I can convey is one that everyone knows but bears repeating. Education is a function of the state. When federal laws affecting higher education change, the underlying reason involves access to federal financial aid. But state laws pertaining to regulation of post-secondary education are not confined to compliance with federal rules regarding access to financial aid. State laws define everything that a post-secondary institution must do to operate legally in that particular state. The state determines what post-secondary education to regulate and how to regulate it. That is why prior to SARA, institutions needed to contact each state in which they intended to provide distance education. It is also why institutions paid fees to become authorized in some states, but were not required to do this in others. SARA is specific to distance education. When states join SARA, they agree that providers of distance education originating in another SARA state need not seek authorization or licensure in their state, provided that the provider is a SARA institution and that the education being provided falls within the parameters of SARA. So while SARA has made it easier and cheaper for institutions to instruct students in other states, it is still complicated. One reason is because SARA does not cover everything that could be constituted to be physical presence in a state. Another reason is how a state regulates post-secondary education varies from state to state. While there are some similarities, there are many differences. The third thing is that education across state lines for occupations leading to licensed professions poses its own set of issues and problems. That is because multiple agencies in a state are often involved, further complicating what institutions must do to remain in compliance with SARA and the state.
Oh, that is just so important, Sylvia, what you just shared with us, because what we've been talking about is these federal regulations, but we've been talking about how the foundation is in the states, and you've just really captured for us, the importance of the institutions being cognizant of it's the states that we are needing to be compliant with ultimately. Now, we have the benefit of those who are participating within SARA to have a certain set of rules about a certain set of activities, and that is very specific. There are things outside of SARA, just as you've mentioned. So I'm really glad that you underscored that. Thank you very much. We have some questions that some of our members have shared with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Miriam Boki, who's going to be providing a couple of these questions for us.
Do states' higher education agencies expect that institutions will contact them to advise that the institution is part of SARA for purposes of compliance for the activities that occur in the state?
Well, I wish I could give you a straight yes or no answer, but as Russ had said before, it's not that easy to give a yes or no answer, because the answer depends. If we're talking about Virginia, which is my state, you don't need to contact us. And the reason for that is because we've never regulated online education, distance education. It's never been regulated. And us becoming a SARA state didn't really change the way that we regulate institutions. So pretty much we don't need to be contacted. But it's not like that in every state. And I think the best way, I can't give you every single scenario, but I can give you 3 very easy, basic scenarios and what you should do. So if you are an institution that has just become SARA, you're now a new SARA institution, and you are regulated by a state, you actually had to get licensure in that state. Well, in that case, it makes sense that you contact the state and you let them know now you are part of SARA. If you are an institution that is not regulated by the state, you do not have anything other than what is in the SARA, requirements. And you do not have any programs that require licensure, more than likely that state will not want to hear from you. There are limited people that work at the state agency, and they cannot field general questions. If you are meeting all the requirements, they're not going to be able to field all the questions all the time. Now, if you are an institution and you are providing educational activities that do not fall within the parameters of SARA, then you need to contact the state agency where that activity is taking place to determine if you need state approval.
Okay, and so that would be outside of SARA. So you're talking about the activities outside of SARA.
Outside
of course,
of SARA.
We need to be able to communicate and find out what the activities are that are being overseen in that state.
Right.
Okay, thank you. That's wonderful. Marshall, is there anything else that...
Yeah, maybe 2 points. One, when an institution does participate in SARA, right after they pay their fee to our office, they receive a letter from us indicating that they are now a SARA participating institution. Sometimes it's been helpful for them to provide those to state regulators in various states. But by and large, the state regulator community is fully aware that we maintain on the NC-SARA website a listing of all SARA participating institutions. And so, as Sylvia mentioned, they are very busy people dealing with lots of things, and the less strain on their activity that this simple notification process can take, the better. So they're quite comfortable with, if there's a question about whether institution ABC participates in SARA, they tend not to ask the institution. They look on our website.
Sure. And there are some states that I know have asked our SAN members, and so what we've tried to indicate to our SAN members is that they be good colleagues and that they share the letter that they receive from NC-SARA when they're asked. And so it just makes for a better collegial atmosphere to be able to provide that.
And one thing that I didn't say when I was talking, when I was giving like the easy scenarios, is that institutions, again, when it comes to those professions that are licensed professions, they also have to be careful with that. I'm not too sure that I mentioned that before. That they do have to be aware, because some states will want to make sure that you are in compliance in that area.
And so we make the distinction there that has to do with licensure board information versus the higher ed regulatory agency.
Exactly.
So those are two very separate things to be in compliance.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Okay. We have one more follow-up question, and again, my colleague Marianne is going to ask this for from some of our members.
If an institution participates in activities that are outside of SARA, such as determining that they will have more than 10 students participating in a field experience at one location at one time, how should the institution address the state where the field experience will occur?
Well, in that particular case, again, it falls outside the parameters of SARA, so the institution must contact the state regulatory agency to ensure that the activity that's taking place does not have to be regulated. And if they call several states, they're going to get different answers. So again, in Virginia, let's say that somebody were to call me with a question and say, we have 12 people that are participating in a field experience. Well, in Virginia, the answer that I would give is dependent on if what they are doing constitutes physical presence within the state. And if it does not, then we would not have anything to do with regulating that particular activity. But all states, again, are not the same. So the answer that I am going to give in Virginia is definitely going to be different than the answer that they will get from a neighboring state.
But what I hear you saying is that they should contact the state and determine whether there is any further action if they are going to have more than 10 students in one activity at one time.
Absolutely, because in some states they will have to do something, and in other states they may not have to do anything at all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Well, just one point. We've said several times that the institution should contact the state, but it's not always that easy to find out who they should contact in the state. And so, as we mentioned earlier, NC-SARA and the SAN organization is going to be improving that, we believe, and at least by summer we'll have some updated information that should be helpful to institutions so they know who they need to talk to in every state.
Right. But in terms of the situation of 10 students participating in a field experience, that goes back to the portal entity.
It does.
To determine whether it's permissible to have that or have to go through a process to have that approved in that state.
Correct. And I agree with Sylvia that the answers will vary state to state.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Sylvia. Okay, at this time, we are thankful to Sylvia, who's able to share with us the state perspective, and we're going to be moving into managing these issues in a more practical way after we take a quick break. We're going to take a break, confer with our staff members who are here, and we hope you'll come along with us. We're going to take a coffee break, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Okay, well that was fun. Welcome back everybody. We're into part 2 of our virtual seminar, and you may see that we've done a little bit of changing up here at the table. We're really pleased to be able to have Christine Galdston with us today. She is the State Authorization Compliance Specialist for the University of Colorado system. And we're very pleased to have her here as we move into the practical aspects. We're going to focus on how the implementation is to work, and it's really going to be helpful for us to have an institution person as a part of our panel to discuss these aspects. So the first person we're going to turn to, though, we're going to start talking about notifications and disclosures. And we're really pleased to have Shari Miller here. As I mentioned before, she is an attorney and a consultant with Institution Compliance Matters. And so she's going to talk to us about these disclosures. So I'm going to turn it over to Shari about professional licensure disclosures.
Thank you so much. We've heard a lot of information today, and Russ has talked about it, Sylvia has talked about it, Marshall has talked about it. Lots of information to digest, as is typical with a SAN event. What do we do with this information as an institution? And why does it even matter? Well, we've heard that there are legal reasons, being out of compliance, not providing disclosures to students can cause liability issues for the institution. Students are more savvy consumers today. They're more litigious. There are plenty of cases that we've seen based on a number of legal theories where students have prevailed in the courts. And the other thing is, why do the institutions have to provide this information? Well, because really we do have greater access to the information. And the regulatory mood right now is to not put the onus on the students to find this information out. Also, we've heard about violations. We see them in the press. We see them in Inside Higher Ed. It affects the institution's reputation. It can affect the accreditation standing. Also, SARA renewals can be impacted by violations of these types of things, not to mention the actual dollar cost that the institution incurs if a student should prevail in a lawsuit. So ultimately, the student suffers. And that's why this really matters. Okay, so when I was asked to participate in this group, which thank you very much, I was thinking a flow chart will be so helpful. I'm going to do this great flow chart of all the different requirements and what statute, what regulation they're connected with. And so I sat down and I started to try and develop this flow chart. And it wound up looking like the New York City subway system. And so I thought, well, forget that. That's not going to help at all. So now I've taken a new approach. We're going to view this from the top of Mount Albert, which is the highest peak in Colorado. And I'm basing my explanations or comments on my experience working with institutions from all the sectors in higher education. But this is definitely a high-level overview, so I just want to point that out in the beginning. So the next question is, who is covered by these disclosure requirements? Well, listening to our previous experts, just about everybody is covered by these, at some level anyways. So rather than going into the weeds, no pun intended, being here in Boulder, I'm going to assume you are all covered to some degree, and we'll approach this in very general terms. So where should we start with this? Well, does your institution offer programs leading to professional licensure or certification, such as health professions, teaching, accounting, interior design, flower arranging? But what does leading to professional licensure really mean? The devil is in the details, and that's in the definitions. It seems straightforward, doesn't it? I thought so. The Department of Education says, well, does your program foreseeably lead to a career that requires licensure in a state? Okay, that's simple. But then they go on to say, but it's also based on how an institution actually markets that program. So your institution's intent in its marketing, coupled with what a reasonable student believes about the program, could result in a program being considered one that leads to professional licensure, which could expand the scope considerably. Okay, next question. Where to begin with this information then? So how do you know which programs are being offered that may lead to professional licensure or certification at your institution? Well, a good way to start is look at your catalog or your bulletin. What's listed in there? Maybe it's clear. Maybe there's a really nice listing. It's also very important to look at your website. Go to your department's website pages. How are they actually promoting their various programs? Are they saying that they're going to lead to licensure? Are they implying that they're going to lead to licensure? So you want to review all those types of things. At the institution I was at previously, I had to do a survey of departments. Some programs are just not obvious, like flower arranging, for instance. Who would think of that as a professional licensure program? And the other thing is your administration may not be aware of all the programs that do lead to professional licensure. Also, I think it's very important that you work with your ITS and your institutional research teams to create a report that lists which programs do lead to professional licensure. And along those lines, it's very important to cast a wide net because state requirements vary, as we've discussed, what they license. Minnesota, for instance, licenses 39 different professions. We talked about New York being stringent, things such as CPA, which you would normally think of as a national type exam. And then, of course, we have Louisiana and their flower arranging. And let's not forget about Alabama. Alabama actually does have some requirements regarding post-licensure, RN to BSN programs. So once you gather this information, it's very important to put it into a report. And now the best type of report for this is one that's tied to your enterprise system, whether you're PeopleSoft, Banner, or whatever. And the reason for that is you can tie it down to the student level. And that's very important when you get to the disclosure and the communication piece, because you've got the access right there, the program tied to the student. In addition, at your institution, you'll want to stay on top of any new or changed programs. And what I found helpful was to become a step in the new curriculum approval process. So anything that was being proposed had to come by me first, so I knew what was going on. And of course, it was so important in this line of work to develop good working relationships, especially with your people in marketing. so that you're in the loop with what's going on, and also so that they're educated and can alert you if they see a program that comes across their desk that seems to imply that a student will be eligible for licensure in the program that maybe isn't usually considered to provide the prerequisites for it. Okay, now, you know what your programs are that lead to professional licensure. So what do you do next? So that was easy, right, to figure out those programs. That only took me 2.5 years. So hopefully your institutions are more organized. So if you know where your students are, here are a couple of possible approaches to dealing with this information. If you have just a few online students in programs leading to professional licensure, start your research with the states that those students are in and the professional programs that those students are in. And it's easy to gather that information. But the thing is, you need to realize that you can't stop there. You have to continue to expand your research to all 50 states and to all the programs that your institution offers that lead to professional licensure. So if your institution is one that has just a really broad presence across the country, as many of them are, then you're basically going to have to do a full 50-state review of which states license those professions that your institution offers. And this generally is the safest approach anyway, but it is time-consuming. I want to point out that with either approach, it's very helpful to consult with the websites for the national associations of those professions, because they generally provide contact information for the state licensure agencies. And then, of course, if you don't know where your students are, and we will cover this a little bit later, the safest approach is to do the full 50-state survey of the licensure requirements for all of your programs that could lead to professional licensure. So what information do you need to obtain when you're doing your research of the professional boards? There are basically 3 things that I like to gather. First is, what academic prerequisites must a student have to be eligible to sit for an exam where the student resides? Secondly, does your academic program actually meet these requirements? And the third issue that I think is helpful if you're doing the research is, are there any other requirements, such as background checks, that must be completed prior to being eligible to either sit for the exam or practice in that particular state? So now you've gathered all this information, and it was very simple to get, which of course I'm joking, but at least you've done it, so that's good. So who should receive these disclosures? Well, first of all, on the individual level, the students enrolled in the professional licensure program should receive the disclosures. Russ talked earlier about prospective students, and those individuals prior to enrolling should receive the disclosures when there's a distance ed program that does not lead to licensure in the state where the student resides. Also, if your institution has a change in its program's ability to meet licensure requirements, that should be disclosed to both the prospects and the current students. It's also important to get a written acknowledgement from the student and the prospect indicating that they received the disclosure. Now, this written acknowledgement, it can be combined with other such acknowledgements, like an enrollment agreement, something like that. It can be included as an email link acknowledging receipt. But the important thing is you want to keep that documentation in the student's permanent file. Now, regarding general disclosures, and Russ talked about both individual and general disclosures earlier as far as how they're described in the 2016 regulations. You want any general disclosures to be prominently displayed on your website and catalog or bulletin, whichever your institution uses. They should not be buried someplace. They should be easy to find, searching for disclosures or those types of things. So please don't hide them. You'll want to indicate whether the programs meet licensure requirements in each state. Now, the 2016 regs had a couple of other requirements regarding this. If you know the information, you must disclose it. And if you don't know the information about whether your program meets professional licensure requirements, you need to publish a statement to that effect that your institution has not yet determined whether its programs meet applicable state prerequisites for licensure. And as you know, SARA also has requirements for disclosure as far as whether you know or whether you don't. But even if you don't know, that's only the last resort, and you should do a very thorough job in trying to obtain the information prior to resorting to that. And it's important to keep very detailed documentation of any communications that you have had with the state licensure agencies that show your efforts and attempts. Regarding general disclosures, another thing that's helpful is some interactive maps that I have seen. There's some great sensational award winners out there who've created really neat maps about how to display this information. You can also refer to non-institutional websites for the information, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, such as the National Association sites for professional boards. Also, I want to again stress that if you are linking to an off-institution site, it's the institution's responsibility to make sure those links are working and to make sure you are checking those on a regular basis. Before I wrap up here, I wanted to point out a couple of excellent resources that are available to all of you regarding the topic of professional licensure. Cheryl Thompson has done a masterful and excellent job at white papers on this topic and other topics as well. And those can be found on the SAN website. There are also great past webinars about this topic that would be helpful. As always, stay up on the issues with Russ's blogs because that keeps us informed of what's happening in the current arena. And if you are lucky enough to have a local SAN chapter, please be active in that because those can be very helpful.
Thank you very much, Shari. And when Shari was talking about the blog posts, you all will recall that's the Frontiers blog, and you will want to read those on a regular basis. Not only do they cover state authorization topics, but they cover other topics that are important to our state authorization members as well. They're important to have some kind of basic knowledge, but also because we'll have specific things in regard to state authorization and SARA that are part of those blog posts. And then, of course, if anybody needs to be able to find those white papers, you can find those on the WCET website on the state authorization issue pages, and the new SAN website will be available in the upcoming months. What are the other resources? Oh, a SAN chapter. And yes, what she was referring to there is that there are some groups that have been created in some of the states that are a group of state authorization or SARA institutions that got together. They're not an official SAN, if you will, but they are regional state authorization groups to be able to discuss some of these issues and have that kind of network and collegial interactions on a regular basis and cover regional issues. So thank you very much, Shari. We have, as you can imagine, a number of questions about disclosures. And we're going to be going to a video here from Emily Woods of the University of Kentucky.
I am Emily Woods. I am the compliance coordinator at the University of Kentucky. And my question is, if licensure reciprocity agreements, such as the Nursing Licensure Compact or the Physical Therapy Compact, can meet the requirements for licensure disclosures. Sometimes when I ask programs for their licensure requirements, they said, well, we have reciprocity in those states. But my question is reciprocity a separate issue? And does licensure reciprocity meet the licensure disclosure requirements?
Emily, that's an excellent question, and thank you for asking it. I have to tell you, some states have additional requirements for licensure above and beyond just membership in the compact. For those of us who are cynics, we like to refer to the source of licensure as a revenue generator. I happen to be a certified pharmacy technician, and in Arizona, to be a licensed pharmacy tech, you have to be certified by passing a national exam. And then you have to apply for state licensure and pay an application fee. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, well, we have another question, and this question will be provided by my colleague, Marianne Boki, and it's a question from Allison Rogers from Texas Women's University.
Allison Rogers from Texas Women's University has this question. I would appreciate if you could cover which disclosure rules, laws, regulations, SARA, speak to only DE programs that prepare for licensure and which speak to all programs that prepare for licensure. I know that the best practice is to cover all licensure prep programs, but I'm often asked to explain the reasoning behind these disclosures. And I even get confused sometimes on which regulations pertain to which delivery method. I just want to have a clear understanding so that I can confidently and correctly explain the why to my administration and program directors.
Allison, I'll have to say that's a pretty complicated question, and you are correct that the best way to minimize your institution's liability is to provide the information for all programs that lead to professional licensure. There are reasons to cover all programs. One, you won't miss one that you thought was only distance ed or on campus or vice versa. Many of the federal and state laws don't distinguish between on campus and online. So you'll be spending a lot of time researching each and every nuance, which is good, by the way, but very time consuming, and most of us just don't have that kind of time. The federal regs that were published in December of 2016 cover distance education programs leading to licensure, but other federal and state regulations cover all programs. I would encourage you to review the white papers that Cheryl Thompson has written on this topic to provide additional support for your conversations with your administration as well, because each situation is totally unique at your institution. So does anybody else want to add to that?
I do. Russ and I participated in some federal negotiated rulemaking sessions in early 2014, and this topic was discussed. What is the obligation of institutions about notification? And was that obligation merely in relationship to programs that they offered online or through distance education, or does that obligation also go with face-to-face programs offered on campus? And there was a lot of discussion about that, but it was abundantly clear that the majority of the regulators thought that that was a broad institutional obligation, and that the department staff thought so as well. And to come back to re-sing my song about moral obligations of an institution, I think it's important to let students know the implications that they receive, regardless of whether the program is delivered with them sitting in the seat in the university classroom or whether they're taking it online. I think that's, as Shari indicated, that's the only safe position for an institution to take about this.
Yeah, and if I may too, let me follow up on that, that what I hear when people call me about this issue is that they say, our faculty or our administrators say that this is the student's responsibility to look this up, because they're the ones that are going to be licensed, they're the ones that should be responsible for this. Now my problem with that is that they also say, well, one of the reasons they're saying that is that this is very hard to do. So here you have a room full of PhDs who know the curriculum, and they're the ones that understand whether the curriculum meets the state regulations or not. And it's too hard for them to figure out whether it fits or not. And then what they're saying is that some student who might be 18 or 41 or whatever they are, who've not taken the first course, is supposed to be the one who figures out whether that program meets the requirements of their state or not. And I just find that, again, back to moral obligation, that you know, I'm reading into this question about the why about all this, that they're trying to say that, well, it's really the student who should be doing it. I don't see how that can fly, that it really have, and I wonder if you have any response to that, Shari.
Well, I think the Department of Ed has taken a pretty clear position on that as well, that the institutions can't put that upon the student. They really expect the institutions to be doing that research. And I'm sure just for the very reasons that you've pointed out, which are right on point. That yes, we have better access to the information. We aren't just entering the program, or maybe even just a prospect looking at a program. So we're the ones that should be doing that research.
I'm equally skeptical about the idea of just let the student do this. We've contributed a bit of confusion, we meaning SARA, by a provision that we have about notification. And it's the idea that if an institution is unable to determine whether its programs meet state licensure requirements, it's permissible for them to provide the student contact information for the licensing agency in the student's state. Now, the idea behind that was not that that gave institutions a choice. You could either do the work to find out, or you could just let the students do. That was never the intent. The intent was to deal with something that a number of institutional people told us about. They said, we have taken our program in ABC and taken it to state regulators in state X and asked if our program will allow students to sit for professional licensure upon completion, and they won't tell us. Well, now, my orientation to that is if an institution is doing everything it should do to get the correct information from a state, and the state will not provide that information, that's not the institution's fault. It's bad bureaucracy. I was a state bureaucrat for 20 years. That's just horrible bureaucracy. I understand why occasionally states do that, because they think the people asking the questions can't understand the answers. But that ought not happen. But if it does, the institution ought not be held responsible. The idea is that if the student, who is presumably a resident of the state and a voter within that state, approaches a political official, maybe they can get some light shown on this unresponsiveness, which really misserves or disserves the people of the state. But I couldn't agree with Russ more on this idea that this is all too complicated, let's just let the students do it. That just should not happen.
And if I may, just to piggyback on all of the points that you've made, it no longer is a choice in any case. Under the new federal rules, it'll be effective in July. Right. And I think to the point that you were making, it's ultimately what's in the best interest of the student. If you let that guide you and you exercise your due diligence and document it, to your point, Shari, and you still can't get a definitive answer in writing, verifying your understanding, you've done the best you can do and you make the best decision under the circumstances with that guiding principle of what's in the best interest of the student and give them the information that you have. It's really the best you can do. But you have to try. Yes. As an institution.
You know, people listening to all of this who haven't done any of it are bound to be thinking, this is so incredibly complicated. Do we really have to do this? Or won't this eventually just go away? I don't read the winds that way. I don't think this is going away. I think there will be greater attention by states on the issue of whether out-of-state institutions are paying attention to the requirements of their state licensing bodies. And I think the U.S. Department of Education is going to continue to be more interested in this. And I don't see our society moving away from litigation when consumers have a problem. So, like it or not, it's something that institutions and all of us have to deal with.
Yeah, and that's the last point I said. Forget altruism.
Right.
Forget regulation. If you don't want to be sued, you better start doing this.
Thank you all for addressing that about trying to work with the boards and how it is our responsibility to try to get to this information. One thing that I would like to address, and I would hope that Marshall will help me follow up with this, is about the requirement within SARA that if it's a face-to-face program but has a experiential learning component out of state, that does require, that is a little bit different than the way the federal regulations are set up right now, the ones that are supposed to be coming in July. But the SARA already requires that if it's a face-to-face but with out-of-state experiential learning, that those disclosures must be made.
Yes. We do have a number of institutions that participate in SARA but don't deliver any online programs, for example. They use their participation in SARA to cover their placing in other states students who do experiential learning, whether that's clinical rotations, internships, student teaching, so forth and so on. In many states, without SARA in place, that would trigger physical presence. And under SARA provisions, institutions are allowed to make up to 10 placements at a particular location without triggering physical presence in the state. There is the proviso, though, of course, if those are in disciplines that lead to professional licensure, the institution still has to deal with the relevant licensing board there. We are this spring going to be asking institutions to report on those placements that they are making in other states. It's going to be a voluntary reporting for this spring, and in May we plan to ask our board to make that mandatory in the future. Why in the world would we do that? Because they're a part of the activity that SARA does indeed cover. They're a part of the cross-state activity of institutions, which is becoming greater and greater. They do trigger physical presence, or would trigger physical presence if SARA were not in place. And during the development of SARA, it was quite clear that state regulators had a great deal of interest about who was coming into their state to do this or that or the other. And we promised to them that we would work toward collecting that information. And so this spring, we're going to make our first attempt at that.
And so, Cheryl, this brings us back to a basic principle, whether SARA is involved or not, that if it's a professional licensure program, or really anything, that if you, well, let's stick with professional licensure since we're on this issue. If you have a practica or an internship or an externship or student teaching or whatever you call it, and it's the student has taken all of their courses residentially on campus, but now crosses the state line to do any of those activities, that there's still the expectation from the state that you figure out whether you need to have the approval in that state or not. And some of the issues can be covered by SARA, some are not. You have to go outside of SARA to get those sorts of approvals, but that is a big point of confusion. We hear a lot of times that they think, well, if it's all face-to-face except for that, we don't have to worry about it. That's simply not true.
Right.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because that is a distinction that we need to be able to share. Right. So thank you. And yes, you know, in regard to everything that we've been saying too, we have had some pushback from some of the licensure boards to be able to gather that information. That is a frustration. And this is leading us into our next question, but I was contacted by a colleague, Jennifer Lewis from the University of Southern Mississippi, who shared with me that a licensure board was not willing to indicate whether they would approve of the activities of the institution in that state, and said that they had to seek private legal counsel to be able to do that they as a board would not provide that for her. And so there was naturally a frustration, which leads us into our next question. And Charlene, our colleague from East Carolina University, has filmed this question.
Charlene Lee from East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. What is the correct wording institutions can use if, after exhausting emails and a phone call to a professional licensure board, you cannot determine whether your program meets licensure requirements in that state?
Charlene, I understand this can be extremely frustrating, and I've experienced it myself, and I think all of my colleagues have as well. And, you know, first of all, when you can't even get the information that you're making a good faith effort to obtain, that's very frustrating. And I've been told the same thing, that, you know, if you can't understand it, then you need to hire an attorney in the state. And so if you repeatedly receive this response from the licensure board, there are a couple things you can do, at least the things that I've done in the past. Number one is maybe you need to try a different approach as far as who you're contacting. And what I found useful is to, while it's very time consuming, to look at the board minutes to see who contact people might be that are listed in the minutes, and that you could maybe try and circumvent if there's somebody that, like the guard dog at the receptionist's phone, that you can't get by if you're trying to call. And maybe try and pull names from the board meeting minutes and contact somebody around another procedure. That might be helpful. And otherwise to go right to the executive director. And so sometimes those things work as well. But if you have exhausted all of those options and you still can't get the information that you need, you do need to document this, as we've been talking about, and of course attorneys like to document everything. You can tell, I mean, I've documented my whole life here. So you want to record all attempted interactions. Obviously, any communications in print are best, so keep all emails. But if you do make a phone call, because you've exhausted all email channels and nobody's responded to you, when you make that phone call and you actually maybe connect with somebody, then what's helpful is to send an email confirming what was discussed in the email and indicating that if this is not correct, please contact me, so that it puts the burden back on the agency. So if you have stated something that's truly not correct, that they should get back to you on that. But again, the documentation is really important. And the other thing that's helpful is, all of our colleagues may have had better success with contacting somebody else, and it's good to share that information with each other to see if somebody else maybe did have better success, that you could try that approach.
That is great. You know what reminds me of is several years ago, before SARA, when we were all trying to contact the higher ed agencies, some of them were so understaffed that they couldn't reply right away.
Exactly.
And so we had to do the best we could to document all the types of interactions that we had had with the higher ed agency to determine whether we were in compliance in that state or not, as we were all trying to untangle what those requirements are. Very, very strong parallels here.
And that's an excellent point. And I don't mean to throw the professional licensure boards under the bus, because they're very understaffed, and most of them are still not even aware of why we're calling. And that level of confusion, it's just easier to deal with more pressing issues first. And we're trying to deal with that to enlighten the agencies about why we're calling through some other activities that Cheryl and I are involved in. But it is true, they're not staffed to handle this.
Right. And to piggyback on your point, another thing you can do in terms of your practice and best practice is document for yourself, as you've done the research as an institution that supports your position and the decision that you've made, even if there is some ambiguity, while you continue in the process of trying to get a confirmation or verification of formalized from the administrator or the agency. And you may or may not, depending on the circumstances, utilize an outside counsel with that, which was sort of the whole point of this original question.
Right.
So, but even just having that documentation, even if you've been unable to obtain a formal verification
to at least show your reasoning as to how you came to that. That's an excellent point.
Good point. Good point. Good point. Great. Now we have another question from one of our colleagues. It's from Lisa Sedlock. From George Mason University. She has hers videotaped as well, and she's talking about national certification. So let's watch her video.
Well, hello, my name is Lisa Sedlock. I'm from George Mason University. And my question is, what's expected as far as disclosures go for programs that are more of a national certification or a license instead of a state-regulated license? For example, the MPH program would allow anybody to sit for the exam that's a graduate of an accredited program. Most states allow you to sit for the CPA exam. Another example, if you meet the educational requirement of 150 hours. And although there's differing state qualifications for the CPA exam, the education standard is 150 hours. We also have education programs that lead to ABA certifications, applied behavioral analyst certifications. And that's the same situation as far as the education preparation and the eligibility to sit for an exam. I'm looking for any examples of institutions that have addressed this issue, insight as far as to the language that they've used, and what did they do as far as the state and federal regulation is concerned for licensure programs that are not regulated by the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for your question on national exams. And as I had mentioned earlier, there's a difference between a national exam and necessarily being able to be licensed. It's common for some of the health professions, for instance, to require passage of a national exam as one step in the licensure process for the state. So again, you're going to have to check all the state requirements to see if passing the national exam will satisfy all the requirements, or if you actually have to do something extra to be licensed in that particular state. Anybody else have anything that you'd like to add to that?
I just would agree that it's important. What you need to understand is what the state requires. So it's sort of a secondary peripheral issue, whether or not there's a national exam. It's probably not something you need to focus on all that much, because what really matters is what the state requires. And it's nice if there is one exam and and that's the one exam but it really is all about what the state requires.
Great answer. Okay, we're going to shift gears just a little bit in the same area, but shift gears slightly. So, Shari, will you explain to us how institutions will know what states they need to be providing information?
I'm going to talk about student tracking. How do we know where our students are located? This seems to be a challenge for many, many, many institutions. And it's so important, as we've heard repeatedly throughout this presentation. You simply need to know where your students are located. Ignorance is no longer a defense in this area. And the federal regs kind of complicated things a little bit, as Russ alluded to, in that they also added the term state of residence. Up to this point, we've always been concerned about where a student is physically located when they're completing their program. But now we've got this extra level, so we really need to figure out how to get both pieces of information about our students. And many institutions have developed pretty workable solutions on how to do this. And you can check the SAN website. There are some Sensational Web or Sensational Award winners. And you can look at what approaches they've taken as far as determining the physical location of their students. Probably the best approach is to require students to confirm. A couple of things here. Require is the best approach, and have the students confirm their state of residence and also where they are physically located each term. So you don't have to put a GPS beanie on them, but each term you really should be tracking that. And this process doesn't have to be pretty. I know when I started it at my previous institution, it was done with pencil and paper. And then I moved to an Excel spreadsheet. And that's an okay way to start. And it's probably more helpful, actually, before you develop the more technological solution that requires more resources. But the thing is, you really need to strive for accuracy and for it to be thorough. Having said that, as you indicated, it's never going to be perfect, but you really need to strive for that, realizing that you're never going to know where every single student is, whether their physical location or their state of residence, but you need to try for that. So you can tie this process to the enrollment process. Some institutions have built an enrollment component in their PeopleSoft system. That's obviously an expensive approach, but it's a very workable approach. Or using the student portal when a student logs in to access their email or anything like that. That's also a way to do it, and that was how it was done at my previous institution, and that worked out pretty well. But again, the bottom line is you need to know where your students are located. There just is no way around that. How can you be in compliance with your other requirements, the professional licensure disclosure requirements, those types of things, if you don't even know where your students are? I was just at a conference, and for institutions that have few more financial resources at their disposal, there's some pretty nice commercial products out there available that will do attendance tracking and record clinical hours. And they also have the capability to determine physical location using GPS. And so there are different systems. You can either build your own or you can buy a commercial system. But the bottom line is you need to know where your students are, both their state of residence and where they're physically located.
Thank you, Shari, and thank you for making that distinction between their residence and where the activity is taking place, that we need to know both of these things per what the federal regulations are saying right now. The state's required to know where the activity is, and then we have this other federal regulation until we get it more defined about what this residence aspect is that they're requiring as a part of the regulation. We have a few questions, as you can imagine. We have a video that we're going to share from our colleague Miranda Hines from the University of Kentucky.
Hi, my name is Miranda Hines. I'm with Distance Learning at the University of Kentucky. When we spoke to our registrar's office about requiring students to report their permanent and current address, we were told that our legal counsel said that we could not require students to provide their permanent address. So we're curious whether others have encountered this, and if so, how other institutions are getting around it.
Thanks for that question, Miranda. That's an interesting one. Possibly it could be an organizational preference, but I'm not aware of any law at this point that precludes this, especially considering how many federal, state, and SARA provisions there are that require knowing this information. But, you know, we always like to learn what's current, and so possibly we've missed something. So what you may want to do is ask if you could be pointed in the direction of language that says that you can't provide this information. Because we share it with each other once we can't be on top of everything. So that would be one thing that would be helpful for us. It's also kind of what I call a mutual teaching moment. So if you're able to obtain information that would help the rest of us, this is also an opportunity for you to share information with both your registrar and the general counsel about the information that's available on the SAN website and what you've learned from the blogs and things like that. And plus the white papers also provide a lot of useful information with citations that might be helpful. And what I found to be useful, and I think we were talking about this earlier, is that it's so nice to try and form allies or alliances with others at your institution. Sometimes it's not within the realm of possibility for us in our compliance positions to go directly to a top administrator and ask a question or have a discussion. And so if you have a good relationship with the registrar, you might start by educating the registrar about the particular issues, and maybe you can form an alliance with that person and they'll present the information on your behalf to the general counsel. So those are some things that I've found useful. How about others? Have you found anything?
I would just add that notwithstanding this question, because I'm not really certain whether or not asking this information is prohibited under any circumstances, but I have noticed, sort of anecdotally, there are a lot of myths that fly around in state authorization, and so I would, take everything with a little grain of salt and go do the legwork on your own to confirm. I was just talking to a colleague who emailed me and said, "Oh, California joined SARA. Did you hear about this? I was just at a conference and everybody was talking about it." And so, of course, I went and I'm like, "Really?" Because I happen to live in California, and of course they haven't yet. So I just see it time and time again that there's a lot of misinformation, myths. So always try to dig a little bit deeper and confirm what you're hearing out there, because it isn't always correct.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. Is that I think the advice about asking the person to give you the citation for it is really, really good advice, because maybe there is something we missed. Because we were all surprised by this remark, but if we learn from it, that's great. The other is that another way to check is that the state authorization network is that sometimes people will hear something, or they'll hear a rumor, or they're the first to find out about something, and if you share it through the state authorization network, you can find out, say, And if nobody else in the whole network has ever heard of this, the likelihood that this is true is probably pretty low. So we do need to do the double checking.
And we can do that through our listserv questions as Russ was just discussing, so that would be very helpful. So thank you very much. Very similar question, has to do with determining location. We have another video from Sarah Cheverton from James Madison University, which happens to be my alma mater, go Dukes. So I want to go to this video.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cheverton. I'm at James Madison University as the Assistant Coordinator of Online Learning. Our Office of Institutional Research has been using permanent address for location in the OPEDS report. So in search for a location source data, a real location source data, we discovered that we asked students to verify their local address every semester during an online check-in process. However, when we ran the query, we also discovered that that field is not required, and thus we had a return of less than 50%. So we're hoping that the registrar's office will make location, that local location, a required field during the check-in process, but for now, we have no effective method for collecting the data. So I'm wondering what we should do.
Thanks for that question, Sarah. I too came from an institution where such compliance activity was voluntary, and it can be frustrating and challenging. One thing that I found useful, at our institution, we had used the student portal as our way of monitoring or gathering student physical location data. And because it was totally voluntary, we added a pop-up flag. So every time a student logged into the portal, they would get this basically pop-up, but they had the opportunity to bypass it. And so they could continue to bypass it forever, but my IT team then would run a report indicating who had bypassed it, and then I would send up a follow-up email to those individuals to determine, where they were physically located. And this way they weren't precluded from logging into something that was time sensitive, such as an exam. And using that method, I'll have to say, I was pretty impressed. I don't know if just that the students are super compliant there or whatever, but we had a 95% response rate to that information. And it was very useful, especially now as we look at having to do SARA reporting, because we also had a pop-up as far as experiential locations. And the only issue with that is if another application is added onto that same portal query, it dilutes the effectiveness. So you want to be careful about that. But the bottom line is, and as we talked about this earlier, the bottom line, the best way is to make it required. And hopefully your institution will accept that and agree to make compliance a mandatory function.
Let me do some follow-up with this, that for iPads, that there is actually, they do not specify which field within your student information system that you should be using, nor do they actually specify, nor did the regulation or iPads specify how you should be doing this. And so this ends up being a really good take your registrar and institutional researcher to lunch sort of moment where you have to try to figure out what is the best way. You probably have several different fields that are looking at location, what makes the most sense, what could be used for this purpose. And then also let's include the financial aid person, because where is this going to be an issue? And it's going to be an issue when a federal financial aid review happens, or an audit, federal financial aid audit. And institutions have these periodically. They're not on necessarily on a regular basis. And what happens is that the folks from the Department of Education will come in and look at your practices. And you need to have what I'm calling a defensible practice. And so that if somebody comes up in an audit, that you can say, oh, this is something where we believe it's a practice that gets the information that we need. And I start looking at response rates of 50%, and I start thinking that's probably not too defensible. So you need something that's a little bit stronger than that. well, not a little bit, a lot stronger.
Right.
A lot stronger than that, more like the 95%, that you need practices that when you're sitting in that audit, along with the registrar and along with the institutional researcher, that you've come up, you can point back and say, look, we did a practice that we actually do know the location of our students. And so that adds a little bit to that. Going a bit different on all this thing, you had brought up the whole issue about residence in the federal financial aid. And
yeah, kind of the confusion with that.
Yes, yeah. So this is something where, well, Marshall and I sat on the last negotiated rulemaking panel where we were trying to fashion the language for state authorization. And we were very careful about keeping it to location, because that is the term of art. That is what the states use when they're thinking about it. That's what it's always been used in the past. And then somehow in this regulation, it got put out there in terms of residence, and that they've added something. And it's not, and residence is only used in a few areas, like for the military and maybe for other people. So if this were to stand, it would add a whole other burden on the institutions in terms of finding residence, the actual, what is their official residence for no purpose. There's no real purpose to this. And so what we've done, anything that, so Marshall and I and others have written in, what we're trying to do is say, okay, can we rethink that and go back to the language that was in the negotiated rulemaking in 2014, where we're really focused on location and get away from residence, so that we don't have a whole other bit of information that we have to get that really can't be used for anything.
Right. I may be an outlier on this point, but I will say, to play devil's advocate, one of the advantages of the federal rule is that you can rely on the self-determination of the student as to their place of residence, which makes it actually quite easy. And they have to provide their place of residency during the, obviously, the application for Title IV and through the disbursement process and so forth. So from an institutional perspective, it is actually a little bit easier in determining what a student's place of residence is versus trying to figure out where they're located at any given moment throughout the entire course of a program.
Right.
That said, it does conflict.
But there's a problem, because it conflicts with the state.
Yeah,
right.
That is probably true, and there's some historic reason for that, especially for public institutions. They're interested in a student's state of residence because that is how they determine whether the student will pay in-state tuition and out-of-state. You know, it strikes me that one way to perhaps get greater cooperation from students about identifying their location is to tell them why we're asking.
Good point.
So it doesn't take much, it wouldn't seem, but in order to help our institution remain in compliance with federal financial aid regulations, please report your zip code, or however the institution. Just a phrase of explanation. We're living in a time where we all expect to be hacked. We expect that our personal privacy is vulnerable. So if there's a legitimate reason, we shouldn't step away from saying what it is.
And from the student point of view, they actually are done a disservice, because I remember, as I recall, they tie it to the complaint process. And so let's say that I'm a Colorado resident, but I'm in the service and I'm serving in Texas. And so you would be required to give me, the way it's written, as I understand it, you would be required to give me the complaint process for Colorado, because that's tied to my permanent state of residence. Well, the problem with that is that if I went and complained to Colorado while I'm living in Texas, that they would say, we have no jurisdiction over that. So this is where what the federal government has put into place in all of this does not fit with the complaint process that they have in another part, or how the states react to it. It just
doesn't fit reality.
It doesn't fit reality, nor is it. And the big thing that they want to serve the students better, and it doesn't do that.
This is very challenging, as we see. Okay, thank you, Shari. You know, that was great to be able to provide this information about tracking, and we had a really robust discussion here. We're going to turn now to Christine. Christine is here and plays a very important part of our panel today as a current institution staff member. We recognize this is very challenging, and part of our discussion here was what a challenge it is. So Christine is going to bring that point of view to us. So we're going to start with a video that Christine's created about the challenges that she had as coming to this position and getting her arms around what the responsibilities were going to be to do the compliance staff work that she's doing. So let's go to her video. Oh, Christine, I am so glad that you were willing to be part of our seminar. I thought it was very important for us to have an institution compliance staff member be a part of this panel to be able to share with us your angle about how to put this together. I know when I first was working in an institution, it was very challenging. You know, it was the early days of compliance. I didn't know the topic area, so we were trying to pull it together at my institution. So I'm just wondering, you know, what was it like for you, you know, coming into your position at the system to be able to understand and put processes in place?
Right. Well, I've had the benefit of working in compliance in higher education for many, many years. So, and working for other institutions with a focus on state authorization from well before even the program integrity regulations and state authorization. So I have a solid foundation in terms of the content. I would say that the content and the subject is one thing, and it's multi-layered and it's constantly changing and evolving. So it's a challenge for anyone. And what makes it even more challenging at an institutional level is operationalizing it and implementing it. And having worked at different institutions and now at a public system setting, every school is unique and different and offers its own unique challenges in terms of its governance structure, its organizational structure, where this function lives within that, within the organization. So I don't think there's a secret or single way, certainly, of solving state authorization or managing it. It's really dependent on a variety of factors. That said, no matter where you are, it's a challenging area.
Right.
And I think probably the best piece of advice, and I think SAN is wonderful in this respect.
Thank you.
Is trying to build a network and reaching out to your peers. There are a lot of people who are focused on state authorization and have experience in compliance. And if you're new to it, reach out to those people. Try to build those relationships in that network. We've all been through it at one, stage or another. So understanding that it is complicated and that you don't have to know everything necessarily. You don't have to have all the answers. And you just keep taking one step ahead of the other.
Oh, I love that you said that, because so many of our compliance staff folks think that they have to have all of the knowledge about the specific topic area. And what we've shared is that we really need to look out through our institution and have people that we're interacting with to pull that information together. Like, you're the center, but you pull that from different kind of academic departments, the provost's office. So you are the center, but you pull all that information. I think that's tremendous.
Absolutely. This isn't a single function, isolated issue.
Right.
It involves almost every department and role within an institution, depending on the types of programs you offer and if they lead to licensure, especially. It's one of our big areas right now. But there isn't, no single person at any institution, large, small, or somewhere in the middle, could do it by themselves. You have to bring in your marketing people, your admissions people, your registrars, your institutional research, academic, SMEs. So it is absolutely 100% a team approach, and there is no other option. It has to be.
Right.
Because they all have responsibilities in complying with various components and pieces of these various laws.
I love that. I love that it's a team approach, and I love that you added about reaching out and networking, because something that I've advocated all along is you need a state authorization buddy. Totally got that from Finding Nemo for your exit buddy, but I've been advocating that for a long time. You need state authorization buddies, so thank you very much for advocating that. I think our institutions will really benefit from that. Yes, it's hard. Have a team, have networking buddies, And you know, thank you for bringing that to the table, because that is essential, and you've done a beautiful job. Thank you for being with us, you know, for this seminar. Really appreciate it. Okay, researching requirements and tracking students, it's a tall task for compliance staff. And we have Christine here today, as I was saying, as a current compliance staff member. Christine, do you have suggestions or ideas of what institutions can do to work with other stakeholders at the institution to research licensure information and share it with current and prospective students?
That's a great question. And as we've really emphasized during the course of this discussion, this is really complex. This is a very complicated issue with multiple layers. And to add to the complexity is there's a lot of complexity theoretically to these various legal and regulatory requirements and SARA requirements, and having to apply them within an organization adds another layer of complexity because every organization is different. And so I think it's really important to keep a couple of underlying principles that we've also talked about, and always kind of in the back of your mind, why are we even doing this? And they'll help guide you when you bump into ambiguity and you bump into challenges or obstacles as you're trying to work through state compliance issues. And that principle is, of course, why are we doing all of this anyway? Why are there state laws? Why does SARA exist? And what is the federal government's role in this? Ultimately, all comes down to protecting students and doing what's in the student's best interest. As Marshall emphasized, this also has an ethical dilemma. So when you're working through an issue or struggling with a question and having trouble, always ask yourself that question, and more likely than not, it's going to lead you in the right direction in terms of determining, okay, so what do I do with this and what's the best course of action? Another thing that we haven't talked a lot about is, and I'm speaking out to the audience here, I'm not sure who all is watching the webinar and what level of the organization you're in, but your institution's leadership is really critical. It's really important. I can speak from experience, and probably a lot of people watching this webinar can. Sometimes you feel like a fish swimming upstream. There's a lot of collaboration, coordination, and facilitation in these compliance roles, where you're always trying to influence others and get them to understand what's required, and sort of begging and pleading with them to work with you to make sure that your institution is in order. So leadership really needs to be engaged, and the tone at the top is really important in terms of setting the expectations across the entire organization and facilitating the sort of support and resources that are really necessary to tackle this, because it's a very complex area and requires the participation and work of many people across the organization. It's not a job that one person can do.
That's wonderful, Christine. You know, we are concerned about how to work with key stakeholders at our institution. And so SAN gets a number of questions about how do we work with key stakeholders. And so we have a video of Marion Bokey providing one of the questions from one of our members. And so we'll go to Marianne's video.
Do you have suggestions about how a compliance staff member may gain access to various institution offices and departments to be heard on these issues?
Great question. And I think that is probably one of the unifying sort of struggles that my peers, that I hear over and over again, that there are so many different impacted departments and functional units across an organization. It can be really difficult to figure out who do you work with and how do you get them engaged. I think going back to my earlier point that the leadership really does have to be engaged. They set the tone, and they are going to help cascade across the organization and help facilitate the sort of support and the resources that everybody is going to need to make sure you're compliant with these various rules. So identifying those influencers, those people that have authority, and helping them to understand the requirements is important. So I think there continues to be a lot of confusion about what's required. And that's because it's confusing and it's changing and it's very ambiguous. And there's a lot of uncertainty, as we talked about earlier with the federal rule. It's set to go into effect in July, but it's also, in the most recent version of the Reauthorization Act, going to be repealed. So people don't really know what to do with all of this. So really helping to educate as many people across your organization as you can to understand the universe and the consequences and why this is important to them. And that may be different for the different individuals that you're going to need to work with across your organization.
One thing too,
you covered it well,
to kind of jump in, is that there's so much turnover. And so you think, I already educated this group of people, and then another person or a key stakeholder comes in who is totally not familiar with what you're doing at your institution, or maybe not even familiar with the whole regulatory scheme. So I think it's important that everybody realizes they need to do this on a regular basis.
Right, I totally agree.
For those of us who try to provide good information, it's often frustrating how stubborn misinformation is in existing. And unfortunately, the people who spread misinformation seem to be the ones who are most certain of what they are spreading, but that just very often isn't the case. Your example about California now being a SARA state is a good one. We've all dealt with.
Oh, absolutely. We've talked about how messaging is just so important. That's why we created this seminar. This virtual seminar was created to try to help you all have good messaging to share at your institution. Because as Christine just pointed out, the House version of the HEA reauthorization discussed the repeal of the federal regulations. Well, some people thought that that meant that that happened today. So no, it hasn't. That is just a draft. So we still have federal regulations on the books that are supposed to be effective July 1. The draft of the HEA reauthorization is a little look into what the House wants to happen, but we don't have that in place today. And so it's very important for us to be able to message our institutions what actually is the situation on this day and how we need to move forward. So I think it's wonderful to share with our key stakeholders, but one of the things I think from Marianne's question was how to gain access. And we talk a lot about making sure that we have an ally that can help us get to the next level, because some of us, as a compliance staff member, have sat at a position that we're kind of lower in the, some of us were, some of us aren't, but some of us were a little lower in the totem pole. So having an advocate that was able to maybe get us an appointment with somebody of a higher level who will listen, that we can educate and re-educate, you know, as things change, you know, is just really pretty key. So I appreciate you adding that.
Another strategy that I've seen is working your state authorization buddies. And what that is that there's really very few people on your campus you can talk to about this who really get it. So making sure that there are institutions around where you identify people who are doing this and then find out what worked at your place and what worked at my place. And the other thing that you can do with that is that sometimes peers will only listen to peers. That a registrar might only listen to a registrar, or an institutional researcher might only, and start finding out and say, oh, you know, one of my buddies has a registrar who really gets it, and maybe they can call and have a conversation and have that. So, you know, working with other institutions, working through the network and all that, and trying to figure out, work all the angles is what we're saying when we get down to this.
Yeah.
But because no one strategy is going to work for every situation. Yeah.
And yes, it's harder than it ought to be.
Yeah, it's harder
It is. Yeah. I would agree with all of that 100%. And I would also just add that every institution is different, and there is great variation amongst institutions. So your approach may vary, you know, considerably depending on the type of school you're in, how they manage compliance. Is it centralized, decentralized? If you're in an institution that already has some established infrastructure for managing compliance, and you're not a part of it as the state authorization individual, you need to approach those people quickly. And they will have an appreciation, typically. You know, these are professionals that have an understanding. And you can leverage the processes, protocols, and some of the infrastructure that they already have in place, instead of feeling like you need to recreate the wheel, or, you know, again, going back to my metaphor of swimming upstream and feeling like you're trying to plead and beg everybody to do this, if you can leverage some existing infrastructure, that is, I think, a good tip. Bringing legal in as well, I think, is really important, because they will have an appreciation as to some of the implications, consequences, and potential liability of these various requirements, because there are best practices, especially with respect to areas where there's uncertainty or ambiguity, but there are also many requirements that are unambiguous, and they are not optional, they're just required, and they're legal requirements. And so unless your organization is, has a very high risk tolerance, most schools are going to understand, and if you're looping legal in, they're going to really be a part of your alliance, your core alliance, and advocates in making sure the right people understand this and that these issues are being addressed. So.
Oh, that's wonderful, Christine. Thank you very much. So Christine, that was really helpful, talking to us just in general about how we can reach out to other stakeholders. I was wondering if you could help us, maybe some best practices about how to manage doing the research for the licensing board information. Maybe there are other players at our institutions that we could coordinate with, or what would you suggest?
Sure. Again, it's going to depend on your institution, how it's organized, the number of programs it has, and so forth. So every institution is going to be different. That said, one of the more sort of pressing areas right now, because it's a lot of attention, and with the new federal regulation, are programs that lead to licensure. So I would very strongly recommend creating a partnership with the academic program folks.
Excellent.
They are the subject matter experts in those programs. They understand how the programs are delivered, and they should have a decent understanding of licensure certification requirements. Maybe not in every state, but in many states. And so I think that they're really critical partners, particularly when it comes to licensure, programs leading to licensure certification. You all already touched on a few other things or ways of managing this. I know SAN is developing some resources. I think looking to national professional organizations in that profession. I'm not sure if there is one, but a national nursing organization. I know there is one in physical therapy, the ABA, psychology. So search out those organizations. They may have already done a lot of the legwork, or at least have compiled a list of state agencies that you can reach out to and start checking down your list. I also think that in certain cases, and again, it depends on the institution and the level of resources that they have at their disposal, but you may want to consider getting outside help. I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know. Sometimes you need to be efficient, and so you need to find the right people with the right information, and it might actually be less costly to have somebody do that research for you than if you have somebody internally that maybe is on a huge learning curve. I'm just mentioning that's one option.
That's a good suggestion, and we're aware of consultants, and we know that some institutions that have a lot of programs are seeking help, because if they have a lot of programs, it does make sense in an efficiency manner to get some outside help. So that's a great suggestion.
Cheryl, we've been trying to work at this from the other side of things. I give a lot of presentations, and many of those are with various professional groups. The allied health professionals, the physical therapy, specialized accreditors, et cetera, et cetera. I've probably given 20 of those presentations over the last couple of years. There is a great deal of misinformation and misunderstanding. I'll often hear people say, well, we don't have to deal with that because we're a public institution. Those rules only affect the for-profit schools. Well, no. So there's a lot of that. So it's very hard work for institutions to figure out all of these things. So all I'm trying to get across is that we're trying to help from the other side as well.
That's great to hear. I will just add, and this is a point that I think Shari made, as you're going through the process, make sure that you're documenting your due diligence efforts along the way. That's really important. And also, it's not a one and done situation, unfortunately. These requirements have to be monitored on an ongoing basis because, surprise, you may not know this, but they change. So you do need to implement processes and appoint either responsible individuals or figure out how you're going to manage it on a go-forward basis. It doesn't go away,
right?
Just because you've researched it once.
Right. Well, and you made a good point about there are some places where you can get started. If you look at the SAN Wiki, which will be transitioning into the SAN website this spring, but on the SAN Wiki currently is the link to the National Organization for Nurses, also for teaching, counseling, social work, and then we have by state what's been reported as those programs that require licensure in a certain state. So we do have those beginning resources that are available currently through SAN that you can have access to. We have a few questions that you can be surprised there, that we have a few questions about how we're supposed to do this. So we have a video from our colleague Robert Reed from the University of Central Florida.
Hi, I'm Bob Reed from the University of Central Florida in sunny Orlando. We'd like to know what are some successful strategies for out-of-state licensing disclosures to prospective students, and not just distant learners, but all prospective students, because many may take their field experiences out of state, planning to practice elsewhere than Florida. Thanks.
Great question. If I miss anything on this one, I'm going to ask my panelists here to jump in. But I think that probably the best method of providing these disclosures, notwithstanding the potential that you may need to provide an individualized disclosure under the federal rules if you don't meet requirements, is simply a web-based disclosure. You need to make sure that it's prominent. It should be located in a place where the student is going to go for that information. So you'll probably want to put it on a program page. If it's a nursing licensing requirements, you'd want to put it on the nursing program page, not on some administrative page buried somewhere far away. But it is allowable under the federal rules. I don't think there's anything in SARA that speaks to the method of disclosure. And I think it's just become sort of common practice that most institutions post consumer information on their websites unless it is otherwise required to be delivered in some other manner, which is the case for other types of consumer information. But I would disclose it on the webpage.
Great. Any other thoughts? That's very consistent with the things you were sharing. So
exactly.
We have said that a couple times today to help people know what direction to go. So
and
thank you.
If it did include licensing restrictions, then that would be a situation where it should be sent to any prospective students who are interested in that program, as well as any currently enrolled students if that was, for instance, a change in the licensing of the program.
Great. Thank you for that addition.
And there are the odd cases where a licensing board will require some statement to be either on the website or in the catalog or something like that. But again, as you go through those processes, those will surface. But those are happen less often. Yeah.
In addition to being a requirement under the federal rule, I mean, it's just best practice to provide those disclosures to protect your institution anyway.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yep. Okay, well, we have another best practice suggestion for you, question that if you could provide a best practice suggestion to this question, our colleague Jamie Henthorn is going to share with us by video a question that one of our colleagues, Ann Tornice from Indiana State University, provided. Let's go to the video.
Hi, my name is Jamie Henthorn, and I have a question on behalf of Ann Tornice from Indiana State University. We are wrestling with the definition of prospective student. Subpart D, section 668.41a defines it as, quote, an individual who has contacted an eligible institution requesting information concerning admission to that institution, end quote. Being a large institution ourselves, it is impossible to monitor all calls that come in to all of the departments. Probably every office on campus will get calls concerning admission. We do, however, have a small number of designated offices whose responsibility it is to handle those calls. Those offices have a protocol for supplying information to the caller. Can we limit the definition to those offices with that official responsibility?
So this is a good question. I'm going to try to unravel it just a little bit. The federal rules do in fact define prospective student, and within subpart D, they do provide that internet sort of dissemination or publication of information within that entire subsection, with the exception of some specified types of consumer information may be disclosed on an internet website. So I think that a web-based disclosure would be totally appropriate, and it is supported by the current federal regs. Again, SARA doesn't provide a specific manner of disclosure, so that would work. Subpart D of the federal rules provides requirements related to various other federal disclosures, consumer information, institutional information, financial aid disclosures, and so forth. And the federal rules, and I think this question may be conflating a couple of different issues perhaps, because under the federal law, institutions are required to provide what's called a notice of availability that lists where a student can find all of the information contained within subpart D, which now includes the state licensure and state disclosure information. And the notice must contain the name of an individual who is available to answer questions or provide information should a student request it. So in addition to having this information on your website, your notice of availability could certainly and would need to, in fact, identify a responsible individual at your institution who is available to provide additional information about this topic, state disclosures.
It's my understanding too that, so we're talking about professional licensure, so let's take nursing for an example, and that if you have some disclosures that about licensure, that for the prospective students that you should have that somewhere where in the nursing pages, rather than having it off where they have to go through the whole admissions process before they finally find out that, oh, they aren't approved in my state. Have you run into that? And see.
Well, with respect to the licensure requirements, the website would be an appropriate place, and I don't think you would wait until the student goes through the enrollment process. Not to mention that it also has to be disclosed for SARA purposes, and depending on which state, which program, whether the program meets licensure requirements or not, the state might require it be disclosed as well. So I definitely think it's something that you want to ensure is prominently displayed and readily available in a place that the student would probably naturally go to look for that information. One other point on this is that with respect to, because the federal rules do have the most specific requirements with respect to disclosures around professional licensure, and the preamble to the regs explicitly state that at this point the department is going to decline to provide a specific mandate or method of delivery, but as long as the institution makes a reasonable good faith effort, that they should be fine. And so that again goes back to aligning with those guidance that's in subpart D already, and with the generally accepted practice of posting it on the internet website.
Great.
Great.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm very glad we have all of our panelists back at our table today to be able to close with some parting words to share with you all about our seminar today. We're going to start with Sylvia from SCHEV.
Okay, so my parting words are very simple. SARA is specific to distance education. So what I would like everybody to know is that if an institution is performing an activity in a state that goes beyond the parameters of SARA, they must contact the state where the activity is taking place to determine whether that activity is regulated in that specific state.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Okay, now we go to Marshall.
Well, We at NC-SARA are always glad to respond to questions that we receive about policies and procedures, and our colleagues at the regional compacts and the states are as well. But actually a high percentage of the questions that we get are questions that are already answered in the SARA manual. So my parting words of wisdom are to urge people to read the SARA manual, a new version of which is probably going to be on our website by the time this airs.
Wonderful. And our friend Christine from the Colorado University system.
My parting words are that you're not in this alone. Sometimes it can feel very lonely, and you're not stupid. This is just really hard. This is a very hard, complex area that changes a lot. So if you always keep what's in the best interest of the student in mind, that'll probably lead you to the right answer. And don't be scared to reach out to your fellow colleagues and try to build your network and talk to them, commiserate, and look for support wherever you can find it.
Thank you very much, Christine. And now, Shari.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. I think a couple of points I'd like to make. Number one, even if the federal regulations get changed in some significant way, these concepts are not going away. They're going to be with us in one form or another for probably as long as we're practicing in this area. And there are good reasons for it. So we need to realize that, and we need to think about how we're going to approach this at an institutional level. And it's complex, as Christine said. It's a big, big project. And so I think an appropriate quote is, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, and it's time to start walking."
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much, Shari. And now, Russ.
Well, I'd like to give a shout out to our friends at the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. These regulations have been out since December of 2016. We're now getting to a point where it looks like that they're going to be put into place in July. And there's still a lot of questions, and that the thing that we know is that the institutions that we work with, that they want to serve their students well, and they want to be in compliance, but they need the help of better information to know how to be in compliance. So I'm hoping that very soon, in the next few weeks, that we'll get that better information so we can help people to be in compliance.
Thank you very much, Russ. Yes, we think that it's very important to be able to continue to share with SAN the information as it becomes available to us, and we will continue to do that. We hope that you have found this to be a helpful tool and something that you can share and use as messaging at your institution. So, very pleased that you could join us today. Before we go, though, I need to thank Joe Garcia and Mike Abbiati for the support of WICHE and WCET to provide to our mission of SAN. And I'd like to thank each of our panelists, Marshall Hill, Shari Miller, Russ Poulin, Christine Galdston, and Sylvia Rosa-Casanova. We're very fortunate to have had them here with us today, and it's also very important that I recognize our backstage support. We've had quite a good staff here with Jamie Henthorn, Annie Thayer, Mary Larson, and Mary Ann Boki. And I would like to thank CU Boulder, the Colorado University system, and also our technical director, Colin Mahoney. They've been tremendous help, and thank you very much for being with us today, and to everyone who helped make this a success. Have a great day.